Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers. Chapter 309. The motorcade with eye-catching military license plates sped through the capital streets in the middle of the night like a troop of ghosts toward the west. If it were daytime, the passers-by would definitely have noticed the identity and status of this motorcade. At this time, there were occasionally workers driving self-cleaning vehicles. Seeing the military vehicles from afar, they also subconsciously stepped on the brakes and watched the motorcade roar past. Zhou Yingxing was not sitting in the Minister of Defense's special vehicle at the front. Instead, he was sitting in General Miles's bulletproof military vehicle. The two important figures of the federal military were looking forward. Their voices were calm as they discussed some matters. You and I know better than anyone what that pen in front of the president means. No matter why Su Lu went to kill Macklin, he did this. This means that he has made a great contribution to the Federation. Moreover, he is one of the developers of the MX Mecha. More importantly, in the eyes of us soldiers, if this little guy dies just like this, it will be a great loss to the Federation. General Miles's eyebrows glowed under the night light, and a few strands of white could be vaguely seen inside them. He frowned, but then he smiled and said, "The military's war research lab has been analyzing that video for a long time. Recently, those little brats who have been doing exercises have also been studying and analyzing it. How many times have you seen it?" "Once." Minister Zhou replied calmly. "This matter involves the secrets of the Federation. If I see it too many times, the confidentiality will decrease." General Miles laughed. He looked at him with slight ridicule and said, "After so many years, you're still so cautious. You've already thrown the video into the training base. Why are you still hiding it in front of me?" Minister Zhou smiled and shook his head. He didn't say anything. The soldiers of the Federation are forged from iron and blood. Suddenly, a cautious and self-restrained person like you appeared. Of all people in the military, you just had to sit in the position of Minister of Defense. I'm afraid many people in the military would never have imagined this. Admiral Miles looked at him sideways and said slowly, "But I always remember that during the second expedition, if you hadn't forced the fleet to land, my troops would have been finished. At that time you were waving the pistol on the communicator and yelling at the fleet, saying that if the fleet didn't come down, you would kill everyone in the logistics base. Under such circumstances, how could I not listen to your orders?" Minister Zhou said calmly. With just a few simple words, the two soldiers were pulled back to the battlefield a long time ago. At that time, General Miles was already a powerful figure in a certain frontline army, while Zhou Yingxing was only a chief officer in the logistics department. There was a huge difference in status between the two. No one would have thought that after so many years, the two of them would be on equal footing in the military. More importantly, even President Pabre and his wife would not have expected that the two big shots of the federal military would have such a harmonious relationship in private, even though they had very little contact over the years. General Miles sat up straight and said coldly, "Back to business. After all, Su Lu is an active soldier. How could he just die in the hands of those guys? In order to hide the truth, they let our children be the scapegoat? If this little guy can be polished in the military for a few years, he will definitely shine in the war with the Empire in the future." General Miles thought of the surveillance video of the Foundation building that he had watched many times. He unbuttoned the collar of his military uniform and sighed. Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers. How many years has it been since such a fierce guy appeared? I think even that little lunatic Li Feng won't be able to break into the Foundation and kill him. Do you think our teacher back then could do it? The teacher he was talking about was naturally the teacher of the 17th Armored Division many years ago. The current Federation's god of war, Li Pifu. Teacher of course has no problem. General Miles immediately overturned his previous doubts and said slowly, "But in the future war, do we still expect our teacher to come out in person? Wouldn't we be ashamed to death?" Zhou Yingxing listened quietly and didn't say a word. He only looked at the quiet street outside the window from time to time. A few glimmers of light flashed in his eyes and then disappeared quickly. "If I remember correctly, that girl of yours seems to be his woman. Under such circumstances, why are you still so cautious and unwilling to come out?" General Miles leaned back in his chair and began to close his eyes to rest. Zhou Yingxing smiled slightly and didn't explain anything. The hug with that little guy in the cemetery was destined to make both sides take the blame for each other. General Miles didn't hear Zhongxing's voice, but he didn't find it strange. He knew that this guy had started out in the logistics department and had always been cautious and solemn in the military. He would never easily express his opinions. Even though he was now the Federation's Minister of Defense, his temperament still hadn't changed. He closed his eyes and said slowly, "Sulu is a talent. He can't die." On the top floor of the Sanlin United Bank headquarters building, the pure glass dome and the sidewalls were as dazzling as a diamond in the dark night. The head of the Li family, Li Yuangong, was still wearing that small black hat and sitting on that old-fashioned chair. It was a stark contrast to the spacious and luxurious office environment on the top floor of the bank. He put down the phone in his hand. The wrinkles on his face didn't relax. Instead, they were squeezed into lines like weathered stone. They were densely packed and full of heaviness. The meeting in the official residence has ended. Senator Macklin has been confirmed to be a spy of the Empire. Li Yuangong took off the small hat on his head and raised the corner of his droopy lips in self-mockery. He said slowly with a hoarse voice, "This is really wonderful. The first time our Li family interfered in the presidential election, we ended up supporting someone from the Empire. There was never an absolute secret in the Federation. An absolute secret like Macklin's true identity might only circulate in a small circle of dozens of people, but it definitely couldn't be hidden from the heads of the 7 families in the Federation. It was because they were all members of this small circle. Li Xiuzhu was like a child who had made a mistake." He lowered his head and stood in front of his old father. His waist was half bent and his face was pale. His flower-like appearance seemed to be withering. After hearing his father's words, his body bent even deeper. "Mr. Pabre is a very wise person. He won't expose this matter. If he does, everyone who has supported Macklin, including our family, will be embarrassed." Li Yuangong coughed lightly and said, "You don't have to blame yourself too much. Mr. Macklin has even fooled the entire Federation, let alone you and me. Don't think too highly of your ability." "I understand, father." Li Xiuzhu lowered his head and replied. Then he asked, "Sulu has been missing for 5 months. According to the intelligence, Macklin's death should be related to him. Macklin is an admirable person. In the end, such a person was killed by Sulu just like that." Li Yuangong slowly stood up and walked out of the office. From a certain perspective, he is a hero of the Federation. It's a pity that he can only be a terrorist forever. He will be nailed to the pillar of shame in history and then die. "Father." Li Xiuzhu had not seen Sulu more than a few times. As a person at the top of the Federation's pyramid, he should not have paid too much attention to that insignificant person. However, over the past year, it had been proven that this insignificant person had a destructive power that no one could imagine. He was very wary of Su Li's existence. However, no matter how cold and gloomy his heart was, he could not help but be stunned when he heard his father's words. A young man who had made great contributions to the Federation could only meet with such a tragic end? Looking at Macklin's death, you can see that this young man is too unreasonable and too ruthless. The Federation system cannot tolerate such a person who walks on the road alone. Li Yuangong slowly walked out of the office. His aged voice echoed in the empty room, each word penetrating the heart. Killing people at will based on what he thinks is right and wrong. Moreover, he has the terrifying ability to kill people. If such a person is left alive, how many people in the Federation will not be able to sleep peacefully? Including you, this useless father. Think about it. One day in the future, that Sulu suddenly thinks that I deserve to die and wants to kill me. How will I continue to live? Macklin was an amazing person. However, such an amazing person had died at the hands of Sulu for no reason at all in his own base. This fact made some people in the Federation sigh in admiration and regard him as a heroic figure. However, even more important people, while rejoicing at the safety of the Federation, felt an unprecedented chill toward him and wanted to kill him. In the Federation, there was an old saying that when an ordinary man was angry, the world would bleed. Now, elderly Pifu was admiring the scenery by Lake Feiqing, but there was suddenly another ordinary man. Moreover, this young man did not care about the rules at all. Just like Elder Li's self-mocking comment, since such a person had made contributions to the Federation by accident, If he were to live or be released, it would only mean that he would be in danger. Other than the federal military, which had been silent, no one, including the cabinet of the government, the insiders on Parliament Hill, and those big families, wanted to see Sulu live or be released. They silently watched the Federation hide Macklin's story, and coldly waited for Sulu to be identified as a terrorist and then die. As long as this insignificant person died, the world would return to normal. Everyone would be fine, and the future of the Federation would be better. However, for Sulu and Shi Qinghai, this was a despicable and sad situation, and the macho-back mountain manner. Shunli rubbed between his eyebrows. After finishing the urgent documents he needed to deal with today, he noticed that the email in the lower right corner was blinking. He frowned and opened the email. Looking at the words on the email, he could not make up his mind for a long time. After thinking for a while, he got up and tidied his clothes. He walked around the long corridor and went up to the 3rd floor. Outside the huge kitchen on the 3rd floor, Shunli was holding the documents in his hand. Looking at the back of the lady, he said softly, "Bai Yulan wants to come back. He has a comrade who is getting married next month. He doesn't want to miss it." Lady Tai, who was cutting onions, paused on the chopping board. After a while she said indifferently, "This is not a big deal. You deal with it yourself. I'm worried that if he comes back, he might run into Sulu," Secretary Shin said in a low voice. Lady Tai did not answer. She continued what she was doing with her hands. The sharp knife cut the onions into pieces. She was wearing delicate goggles, so she did not cry. Her face was cold. No one could understand her anger and her gloomy mood. Sulu was the little guy she had raised up single-handedly. However, when she found that this person was as uncontrollable as that man many years ago, she felt like she had seen her favorite toy. Once again she tried to jump out of her window and let those cars run over her. This kind of déjà vu situation touched the sad soul of her childhood. Therefore, she would not allow Sulu to live. No one could change this fact. The madam did not pay attention to the differences of opinion within the government, nor did she care to think about who it was that transported Sulu from Fox Fortress to the military prison on the surface. She also did not care who it was that placed that video in the training base to nurture the military's interest in Sulu. It had nothing to do with Macklin's death. She had Sulu's biggest weakness in her hands. As long as she was willing, Sulu would definitely die. However, she could still take a look and see just who those people who were stirring up trouble were. Secretary Shun understood the sound of the madam cutting onions. He knew that Sulu would not be able to leave the military prison alive. After a moment of silence, he turned around and left. He sighed softly in his heart. Sulu did not know that he was constantly switching between the two completely different identities of a Federation hero and a terrorist. He also did not have the self-awareness that his life and death were tied to a single line. In the military prison in the wastelands, he often narrowed his eyes and looked at the withered grass that grew crazily outside the window. From time to time, he would lower his head and stroke the bracelet on his wrist, waiting for the right moment. Uncle had taught him to never entrust his life and death to others. Therefore, even though Su Songzi had brought him some obscure information a few days ago, letting him know that there were people outside the military prison who were trying to get him out alive, he still firmly and silently carried out his plan. It was a pity that the security in Qingcheng prison was too tight. That omnipotent old thing never said a word about his naughty request to help him escape. The reason he took such a huge risk to escape was because Sulu knew that the madam wanted him dead. That madam knew his greatest secret, a secret that could break the Federation's the glory of the Charter. Anyone who possessed this secret had to die. Even if he was the Federation's president, there was no exception. The intense pain under his skin woke Sulu from his thoughts. The bloody foam in his mouth had a slightly sweet taste. His blurry vision only focused after a long time. He clearly saw the cold and indifferent official from the Federation's investigation bureau in front of him. This was an interrogation room. He was currently being investigated by the Federation's investigation bureau. It was an exceptionally terrifying investigation. Chapter 310. The walls of the interrogation room of the Qingcheng military prison had a metallic luster, and there were a few simple decorations on the magnetic material floor. Several officials in black suits silently watched Sulu, who was handcuffed to the chair and half-naked. In the quiet room, only the sound of electric current and the faint painful groan from his dry lips could be heard. The spikes that were injected with electric current struggled and shook under Su Li's naked skin, transmitting the pain into his body, but also made his mind more clear. He hadn't slept for a few days, and his mental state was on the verge of collapse. At this time the pain was added to his body, but he could slowly raise his head and squint at the officials. His eyes were calm but filled with pain. After Su Songzi made him sign the legal documents, it was followed by the interrogation from the government. The investigation of the terrorist attack on the Golden Foundation building finally entered the stage of questioning the suspect. This was already the fourth day of the Federation Investigation Bureau's interrogation. Although in these 4 days he had experienced unprecedented mental and physical torture, he remembered the message that Su Songzi passed to him, and had maintained absolute silence. An official looked at Su Lu, who was bleeding on the chair, shook his head at the superior beside him, and turned off the instrument beside him. The current output at this time had greatly exceeded the upper limit of the Federation Investigation Bureau's daily use, but the suspect still refused to speak. Although the official in charge of the investigation knew that Su Lu was a captain of the federal military, he still couldn't understand how he could survive these days of torture. "It's been 4 days and I haven't introduced myself." The thin official of the Federation Investigation Bureau had a pale face and deep cold eyes. He took off his white gloves, walked in front of Su Lu, raised his chin with a finger, and said, "I am the director of the 4th Department of the Federation Investigation Bureau. I am fully responsible for investigating all matters related to the Green Dragon Mountain. I know your identity, but under my hands, don't expect anyone to be able to save you. This is a very boring threat and I know this." The director of the General Hospital waved his hand and signaled for his subordinate to turn off the light in the interrogation room. He turned on the table lamp and shone it on Su Li's bloodied face. "Actually, it doesn't matter if you admit it or not. You've already killed so many people, and you even dared to kill agents of the Special Task Force. Do you still expect to get out of here alive? By the way, I forgot to tell you that I was also in charge of the Linhai State Gymnasium case last year. I know what kind of role you played in that case, but now we are enemies. Don't forget, there were 7 officers from the 2nd MR who committed suicide in the end. Do you think you can last longer than them?" The director of the General Hospital loosened his fingers and let Su Li's head fall limply as he said with a smile. After saying this, he picked up the white gloves on the table and wiped the blood off his hands. He said to his subordinates, "I'm going to get a cup of coffee. You guys treat the kid's wounds, but be careful not to let the kid fall asleep." The officers in the room nodded and began to scrub Su Li's body with clean water. Then they used the military-provided polymer medical spray to quickly treat the small wounds on Su Li's skin. However, the blazing light was still coldly shining on Su Li's closed eyes. The headphones in his ears were still playing terrible noises that sounded like the cries of ghosts and rats. An hour later, the director of the General Hospital finished his coffee and took a nap on the sofa. Then he walked back to the interrogation room. He looked at his subordinate who was checking Su Li's eyes and said with a gloomy face, "You've already broken the record?" "Yes." The subordinate smiled bitterly and said, "I don't know what the result of the interrogation is. Did they also break the record?" The director of the General Hospital said with a gloomy face, "Sure, Qinghai is the best Special Forces member in the Bureau. Plus, he has been trained by the anti-government forces for a long time. I'm afraid he won't get the result faster than us." The electric current was turned on again. Su Lu, who was half asleep, couldn't control his instinct. He groaned in pain. The veins on his neck bulged and beads of sweat flowed down from his forehead. The director of the General Hospital moved a chair and sat in front of Su Lu. He looked down at the heavy magnetic shackles on Su Li's ankles and subconsciously touched his nose. If it weren't for the safety measures of Qingqing prison, he wouldn't dare to get so close to this dangerous person. Su Lu opened her eyes and stared at him, a trace of viciousness flashing past her eyes. "Revenge? Unfortunately, you won't have the chance to take revenge." The director of the General Hospital flicked his finger and ordered his subordinate to use all kinds of technical means to destroy Su Li's body and spirit. He said in a deep voice, "You are an orphan. You became a terrorist because of your family education. I admit that your willpower is strong, beyond my expectations. But you also have to admit that your spirit is about to collapse. Anyway, you won't be able to hold on. Why do you want to suffer more? The director of the general hospital said indifferently, "Why do you want me to humiliate you and your family?" Sulu coughed softly. Only after experiencing the 4 days of interrogation did he know how terrifying the interrogation methods of the Federation Investigation Bureau were. Even if he was really a rock, there were already a few deep cracks on his body. He didn't go through any anti-torture training. He only relied on the breath in his heart and his perseverance to hold on. Through Su Songzi, he knew that he wasn't going to die. Although he didn't know the real reason, he had to clench his teeth and hold on for a while. Su Li's stubbornness made the officials of the Federation Investigation Bureau feel cold in their hearts. They started to panic, but he also knew that he was about to enter the stage where his spirit was dispersing. At that time, under the investigation's professional methods, he might confess for no reason. He didn't understand why the government wanted to interrogate him. He couldn't live after killing Macklin. This was the result he was already mentally prepared for. He also didn't understand why they wanted to link him to the Green Dragon Mountain anti-government army. Was it because of Shi Qinghai? Or did the Federation need a suitable crime? He raised his head with difficulty and said with a hoarse voice, "I killed Macklin, but this has nothing to do with the Green Dragon Mountain. Why did you kill him?" The head of the General Hospital's 4th Department asked quickly. If Sulu still didn't speak, he was really worried that he would break down first. After so many days in the military prison, he always felt that the suspect on the chair was like a silent rock that was about to crush his professional patience into pieces. Because he deserved to die. Sulu lowered his head and said. The head of the General Hospital's 4th Department was silent for a moment. Suddenly, he stood up and took out the earphones in Su Li's ears. He violently pulled on his earlobe, gritted his teeth and said with a trembling voice, "This is not the answer I want. You know what answer I want." Su Li's earlobe was torn open. Blood flowed down his cheeks. He lowered his head again and became silent again. The head of the General Hospital's 4th Department suddenly slapped him coldly and said, "I can't hold it in anymore. I think you can't hold it in anymore. Let's see who can last until the end." Feeling the electric current rushing into his body again, Sulu lowered his head and groaned. President Pabre stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling window of the presidential residence. The dark night reflected on his dark face, but there was a faint glow of light. After the meeting, he took a shower and drank a cup of coffee, but he still didn't feel sleepy. He quietly stood in front of the window and looked at the lawn outside, thinking silently about something. The head of the presidential office, Brin, knocked on the door and came in with a checkered pajama in his hand. He walked to President Pabre's side and said softly, "Madam just woke up. Please rest early." President Pabre nodded and took the pajama and put it on his slightly cold shoulders. He said, "Let her sleep first. I still have some things to think about." Brin nodded. When he was about to leave, he heard the president's low voice. "I have something to ask you." During the term of the former President Xi, Brin, who was still young, started to be the deputy head of the presidential office. This kind of position, in a sense, was the president's most trusted personal butler. Generally speaking, when the president's residence changed owners, the office staff, especially the head and the deputy head, definitely had to leave. This was because no president of the Federation was willing to keep the previous president's trusted aide by his side. This was an extremely dangerous and stupid move. However, Brin stayed. He was even directly promoted by President Pabre to be the head of the presidential office. He was very clear that this was because of his relationship with Lady Tai that President Pabre trusted him so much. However, in these 5 months, Brin's heart had been secretly worried. This was because he couldn't be sure that the president wouldn't keep using an official who had a close relationship with the Tai family. Tonight, at this time, the president kept him in the office. What did this mean? Director Brin's heart was a little nervous, but on the surface his face was calm. He quietly stood behind the president. He didn't ask anything and just waited for the president to ask. After a long silence, President Pabre turned around and looked at him. He said in a deep voice, "Regarding the investigation of the Medellin case last year, what do you think?" Hearing this, Brin felt like his heart suddenly exploded. The Medellin case was single-handedly designed by Macho. The purpose was to help this man in front of him climb to the top of the Federation's power. At this time, Mr. Pabre actually wanted to ask for his opinion. A burst of coldness bloomed from the depths of his heart and took over his whole body. He was silent thinking, but he couldn't find the right words to use. President Pabre looked at him with a calm gaze and said, "We can't let the people of the Federation feel insecure, and we can't let the Federation's self-confidence suffer a serious blow, so it's not convenient to reveal Medellin's identity as a spy." This was the suggestion of the National Security Committee. The military also didn't express any clear opposition, so I accepted this suggestion. But I think that the Medellin case that was suspended last year can continue. The Capital Daily News can put some pressure on Bob and Wood to resume their duties and continue to dig deeper into the clues of the Medellin case. The things stored in the central database can also be selected to be handed over to the Parliament. A series of words flowed out from the calm president's mouth. They were very clear and powerful. This president, who came from the bottom of the hierarchy, said with a trace of determination, "In this universe, it's no longer the era of the previous dynasty. There's no such thing as taboo for the venerated and taboo for the dead. The dead can't be buried, this is not allowed." Bryn was a very intelligent person. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to stay in the president's official residence for so long. He understood the hidden meaning in the president's words. His heart was cold, and cold sweat began to seep out of his back. "What do you think about the soldier named Sulu?" President Pabre suddenly changed the topic. On the surface, he was asking Bryn, but in reality, he was announcing his true opinions on many things. After leaving the circular office, Bryn gently closed the heavy black wooden door. He stepped on the soft carpet and walked toward his own office. His footsteps were unusually heavy. He understood the president's conversation with him. Between Wuxia Mountain, who had supported him in secret for many years, and absolute loyalty to the president, he had to choose a path. When he reached the end of the long carpet, Director Bryn gradually raised his head. His young face was filled with a determined expression. He casually smiled and chatted with the maids who walked past him. He had already made his choice. After spending 5 months with President Pabre, he was deeply impressed by the president's personality and charisma. When a person was born, they had to do something. Following this determined but not pedantic, clear-minded but determined leader of the Federation, whether it was for his own future or to fulfill his spiritual pursuit, he had to take a risk. In his office, he took out his encrypted phone and made a few calls. He told them what the president had hinted at. In the last call, he was silent for a moment. Then he said very seriously, "The heroes of the Federation can bleed, but they can't cry." This was President Pabre's true opinion of the young man named Sulu. The president had never made a clear statement, but today Bryn understood. So he faithfully passed on the president's vague instructions to those who had been waiting. After putting down the phone, Director Bryn unbuttoned his collar. Thinking of the madam's instructions, he couldn't help but take a few deep breaths before he calmed down. The federal military wanted to protect Sulu, but because of the special nature of the military, they couldn't do anything. The old man in Philadelphia, who could influence the Federation, had been sitting by the lake fishing. The president cherished talent and wanted to keep Sulu alive. But because of the strong opposition within the government, the fear of the families behind the scenes, and the intentions of the madam, he carefully maintained his silence. When Mr. Pabre became the president of the Federation, the madam and the great power she represented played a very important role. No matter how one looked at it, President Pabre valued the madam's attitude very much. Holding the phone with his sweaty hand, Bryn lowered his head and sorted out the things he had thought about before. He couldn't help but sigh softly. The young man named Sulu had circled around such a complicated problem, but he had pushed himself to the front. The interrogation in the military prison had entered the last 2 hours of the 4th day. The director of the 4th Department of the Investigation Bureau of the Federation's eyes were red, and his hair was messy. He forcefully tore open the button on his neck and roared angrily, "Did you grow up eating shit? The Ministry of Defense only gave us 7 days. Where did all of your expertise go?" The professional interrogation experts in the room silently operated the equipment in their hands. No one dared to answer because they didn't know how to answer. Why did this guy not break down when he had clearly exceeded the limits of human beings? The current increased again. Sulu, who was sitting on the chair and covered in blood, suddenly laughed vaguely. His laughter was a little strange. He couldn't hold on any longer. The director of the 4th Department of the Investigation Bureau waved his hand and signaled his subordinates to adjust the intensity of the current to the appropriate position. Then he walked in front of Sulu, frowned, and carefully listened to Suli's vague words. Sulu straightened his head with difficulty and looked at the face of the official in front of him. His heart was full of cold emotions. In order to hide himself, in order to escape the prison he had endured for a long time. But at this time, the noise in his mind and the silence of the old man made him know that if he continued to endure, he would only be able to endure until he broke down. When I was young, I was actually very naughty and very good at saying strange things. He narrowed his eyes, looked at the face of the old man, and said in a low and hoarse voice, "But I don't know why later on I became quieter and quieter. Probably after I followed Uncle. He said more and more strange things about this world. I wanted to be an audience, so I had to say less and less." "Young man, wake up." The director of the 4th Department of the Investigation Bureau patted Suli's face and whispered softly, "We'll talk about your childhood story later. Let's talk about what happened 5 months ago. Don't hit me anymore." Sulu did not speak according to his wishes. Instead, he stared seriously into his eyes. "Don't be fooled by my silly smile. I look honest and kind. Actually, I'm a very vengeful person. Otherwise, why would I want to kill Macklin? Now I want nothing more than to break your face. If you hit me again, I'm afraid I won't be able to stop myself from killing you." The director of the Investigation Bureau smiled brightly. His face was pale and haggard from sleep. He did not need to be hit to look strangely scary. Suppressing the anger in his heart, he widened his eyes and asked with a strange smile, "Is that so?" He grinned, revealing his white teeth. He raised his right hand and started to slap Suli's face. Slap, 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 slap. The slap on the face became heavier and louder. Blood dripped from Suli's lips, but he did not seem to feel anything. He just stared at the cold and crazy face of the official through the bright light. His face was red and swollen. Sulu thought about how after he escaped Donglin, due to his identity as a fugitive, he had become quieter and more well-behaved. Occasionally he would go crazy. "I talk less and less, and I don't know how to speak anymore." He coughed out 2 mouthfuls of blood and said, "Even though I've read many books, I don't know how to express myself." "What are you trying to express?" The director stopped slapping and coldly signaled for his subordinate to give him a handkerchief to wipe his face. Sulu, who was sitting in the chair, paused slightly. He lowered his head and said, "I'm used to doing and not saying." After saying that, his pupils in his narrowed eyes suddenly shrank. At the same time, his pale face that was stained with blood started to redden rapidly. His body, which was tightly attached to the chair, started to tremble violently. "Director, should we stop for a moment?" The official in the room noticed the change and quickly suggested, "After so many days of strong electrical stimulation, I'm worried that he won't be able to hold on." The director of the Investigation Bureau stared at Suli's pupils and rapidly trembling body and said indifferently, "Just make sure that he can't hold on." "Director, according to the medical records of the suspect, he has epilepsy. If he really dies, how are we going to report this to the higher-ups?" The subordinate reminded him with a trembling voice, "He wants to pretend to be dead. But unfortunately he doesn't look good. He pretended to have diarrhea. Do you want to poop in your pants?" The director of the Investigation Bureau looked at Sulu, who was twitching in the chair, and said coldly, "Let me tell you, there have been more than 20 people who have done this in front of me in order to get some time to rest. You can try." Suddenly, Suli's body stopped trembling. He closed his eyes tightly and then opened them. He looked at the director without any expression. With a crisp sound, the alloy handcuffs that handcuffed him to the chair suddenly broke. Then, the magnetic alloy shackles around his ankles broke free from the attraction of the magnetic floor and lifted up like lightning. Sulu raised his feet that were shackled with heavy alloy shackles and kicked the chief of the General Hospital's 4th Department right in the face. A stream of blood spurted wildly in the dark air. Under the illumination of the blazing lamp, it scattered in all directions like a flower blooming. In this slow-motion scene, the director of the Investigation Bureau of the Federation didn't even make a sound before he was kicked into the wall with a huge force. With a loud bang, he was knocked unconscious on the ground. Sulu was still sitting on the chair. Just as he finished kicking his feet in the air, he was pulled down by the strong suction force of the magnetic ground. With a muffled thud, his feet stomped on the ground fiercely. The huge impact made his calf muscle fibers feel sore and numb. The combination of the magnetic area and the felon's shackles was the most stringent security measure in Qingcheng military prison. Over the past few decades, perhaps only Sulu had enjoyed it, especially in the interrogation room. Through the electric control, the magnetic area's power was enough to hold the felon who was shackled in place like a nail stuck into a piece of wood. Who would have thought that under such safety measures, Sulu, who looked like he was on the brink of death, was actually able to forcibly break through the powerful suction force and lift his leg? The remaining few officers of the Investigation Bureau of the Federation looked at this unbelievable scene and suddenly froze. They subconsciously wanted to shoot Sulu, who was sitting in the chair, but then they realized that their guns had already been taken away by the prison. Sulu, who was sitting in the chair with a pale face and covered in blood, narrowed his eyes and looked at the officers in the room. Looking at the unconscious director in the corner, his mood was as good as if he had just finished going to the toilet. He said in a hoarse voice, "I don't want to talk. He is too long-winded, so I can only ask him to shut up." Chapter 311. Sulu silently stood in front of the window, looking at the wild grass. The grass was green, but because it was particularly messy, there was not much of a gentle spring feeling. He did not know how wide the Qingcheng military prison was, nor did he know what dangers were hidden in the seemingly quiet and desolate fields and forests. But before he was interrogated, he was prepared to try to escape at all costs. However, this plan had to be temporarily put on hold. That day, when he knocked out the director of the Federation Investigation Bureau with a kick, Sulu thought that he would be greeted with the most severe punishment from the prison. And under the tense situation at that time, the Federation officials responsible for interrogating him would make him pay an extremely heavy price. But what he did not expect was that before the investigation officials in the interrogation room had time to make a violent reaction, the prison sent a group of soldiers to control the situation in the room and escorted him out. It seemed that someone was protecting him, but he did not know who. Sulu looked at the burning sea of grass outside the window. He lowered his head and slowly sucked in a breath. He felt that his situation was like a cloud of fog. Even he could not understand what would happen in the next moment. Frowning, he lowered his body and struggled to move his legs, moving slowly and with difficulty back to the bed. It was only a few steps, but it was so difficult to walk that when he sat on the edge of the bed, he actually let out an extremely satisfied sigh. The echoes of the noise still remained in his ears. His body that had been tortured by the Federation Investigation Bureau for several days clearly felt the pain in every part of his body, especially the muscles on the front of his two legs. Because of the suction force from forcibly breaking through the magnetic ground that day, every pair of long muscle fibers seemed to have rusted. As long as he wanted to move, they would rub against each other, producing intense pain. Sitting on the edge of the bed, Sulu lowered his head and looked at his ankles. The heavy alloy shackles had an additional alloy chain behind them, firmly fastening them to the wall. That day he kicked the director away. The prison was shocked that someone could break through the magnetic shackles with physical strength, and the prison became even more strict on him. No one came to interrogate him again, and his daily food was automatically sent to the cell. Sulu seemed to have returned to those few months in the dark cell, but he couldn't get used to this kind of loneliness. During his dark days at Fox Fortress, his greatest gain was probably his interaction with the Old Thing. Unfortunately, he still couldn't establish a two-way federation with the people of the Federation through the Old Thing. And his greatest question was why the glory of the Charter of the Federation would help him. He had once asked the other side of the Black Dream sincerely, but all he got was a mechanical answer. After communicating with it many times, he was already used to this method. He was no longer afraid, and instead felt a sense of closeness. It was a pity that he knew that the other side was a universe as vast as the stars, and not a real life form, so he felt a little strange. No matter how great a program was, no matter how close it was to life, it was still a program in the end. It would only mechanically follow certain procedures, and these procedures could only be related to the Federation Charter, and Su Li's authority couldn't be related to something like feelings. Relying on his intuition and deduction ability as an engineer, Su Lu was gradually able to deduce that the Federation computer would occasionally help him, occasionally assist him, but it wasn't like the gun in his hands that would take whatever he wanted. It was probably because of the strange experiences he had in the past, the disguised chip behind his neck, the past coma, and the active contact in the black dream. The occurrence of these strange things might have been a logical error in the Federation computer's program, or it might have been some kind of built-in fixed program. Su Lu just didn't understand the truth. Using a certain Federation proverb, it went like this: if you can't understand, can't touch the truth of the matter, then just enjoy the surface of the matter. Su Lu was doing exactly that now. He gently stroked the bracelet on his wrist, a hint of a bitter smile appearing on his face. The faint metallic luster of the bracelet was not eye-catching, and the design was also extremely simple. Without the help of equipment, it would be very difficult for a normal person to tell that the seemingly fine patterns on the bracelet were actually 2 lines of poetic language. During the process of being imprisoned by the Federation, the bracelet on Su Li's wrist had been examined many times, but no problem had ever been found. Because the bracelet couldn't be taken off, the military prison had no choice but to let him carry it around. In the entire universe, Su Lu was probably the only one who knew what kind of secrets and wisdom were hidden in this ordinary-looking bracelet. The bracelet also had a function that often made Su Li's back break out in cold sweat. Early on, after the knife light on Tiger Mountain Road, he had already discovered that the bracelet left behind by Uncle Feng Yu actually hid the secret architectural compositions of countless famous and not famous gloomy prisons of the Federation. After careful analysis, he couldn't help but sigh with emotion at Uncle Feng Yu's valiant life. Who knew how many times Uncle Feng Yu had been captured by the Federation, locked in all kinds of heavily guarded prisons, and escaped from prison countless times. It was a pity that he didn't have a suitable tool at hand to open the shackles on his legs. Su Lu lowered his eyes and narrowed them. Memories and plans flashed through his mind quickly, but his mood was getting colder and colder. There were some people in the Federation who wanted him dead, especially that madam. What should he do? In the interrogation room, Su Lu kicked a high-ranking official of the Federation Investigation Bureau, flying and spitting out blood. It was unknown whether he was dead or alive. With his current status as a prisoner of the Federation, he could only eat countless bad fruits and be punished by the powerful state apparatus. However, the military prison only increased the security on him, but also used security measures as an excuse to stop the follow-up investigation by the Federation Investigation Bureau. From a certain perspective, it was actually protecting him. Everything that happened in the Allure prison was just a concrete manifestation of the change in attitude of the upper echelons of the Federation. At the end of May, year 68 of the constitutional calendar, Director Breen of the President's residence deeply understood the meaning of President Prabhu's silence. In a phone call, he expressed to the relevant parties that they couldn't let the Federation hero shed blood and cry. As a result, the federal military, which had been silent all this time, broke the silence. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Miles, personally presented Su Li's past contributions to the Federation to the president. For example, the MX Mecha, the accidental retrieval of the fatal data of the Space Channel, and for unknown reasons, exposing Macklin's true identity before the Bureau of Proclamation, and killing the most successful spy of the Empire. Due to these reasons, General Miles firmly requested President Pabre to pardon Su Lu. Almost at the same time, Commander Zhong of the West Woods Military Region, who had been at odds with the Federation government for decades, also expressed his attitude to the president's residence. He hoped that Su Lu would be released as soon as possible. The people of the Federation didn't know about these things, but the upper echelons of the Federation were gradually aware. And the soldiers of the Federation knew better than the politicians what kind of harm it would have done to the Federation if Macklin had escaped at that time. The Federal Army was particular about punishing mistakes and rewarding meritorious deeds. In addition to the obscure relationship between Su Lu and the daughter of the Minister of Defense, the connection between the Zhong family of the Westwoods and him that no one knew about, and most importantly, the military admired extraordinary talents like Su Lu and his temperament. The overall attitude of the entire upper echelons of the military naturally leaned towards pardoning Su Lu. With the support of the federal military, President Pabre's opinion on this matter had the most reliable guarantee of power. The procedures for pardoning Su Lu began in the president's residence. However, even if the president wanted to pardon Su Lu, he would still need to be sentenced by the military court in advance, so it would still take some time. Just as the situation was developing in the direction of a beautiful world where the wind blows away and the clouds disperse, they encountered a sudden obstacle. One after another, important cabinet members of the government, several committee chairmen on Parliament Hill, and even the 2 justices of the Supreme Court who had just learned the truth of the matter, cautiously and firmly expressed their opinions to the president's residence through various channels. They expressed their understanding of the president's desire to pardon Su Lu, but they believed that as a terrorist whose hands were stained with blood, no matter how beautiful the results of his actions were, his actions had already violated the laws of the Federation. In order to uphold the spirit of the Federation Charter, the Federation must give Su Lu a fair and undisturbed trial. President Pabre knew that these were all excuses, but many people in the Federation government were unwilling to see a dangerous person who disregarded the law as nothing be released. This represented the opinion of a large number of forces. The president didn't need to consider the opinions of these people, but he had to consider the opinion of that lady. A black car without a logo left the flat lawn in front of the president's residence and headed in the direction of Macho's back mountain. Tonight, for the aftermath of Macklin's death and Su Li's ending, President Pabre and Lady Tai had an extremely frank conversation. It was clear that the president didn't want this matter to affect the unity of the Federation's upper echelons, and he even more so didn't want to affect his friendship with Lady Tai. In addition, he believed that Lady Tai would be explained by him, which was why they had this conversation. During the conversation, Lady Tai calmly expressed her opinion, polite but persistent. However, President Pabre was different from his predecessor. He listened calmly with a smile, but he still insisted on his action of pardoning Su Lu. It couldn't be said that they parted on bad terms, but the atmosphere was at least a bit stifling. This stifling atmosphere was maintained all the way into the car. Xun Li sat quietly in the front passenger seat and said, "The process of pardoning will take another month. I have already finished organizing the files related to Su Lu, and can send them to the Bureau of Proclamation at any time." Secretary Xun suddenly became silent. Without turning his head, he said sincerely, "Madam, the president doesn't know about this. Why didn't you tell him? If he knew that Su Li's existence could threaten the safety of the charter, he definitely wouldn't insist on pardoning." Lady Tai, who sat in the back, wore a dark brown windbreaker. Her hands were naturally spread out by her side. Her expression was cold and calm. She didn't get angry because the president refused her opinion. When she heard Xun Li's words, her thin eyebrows trembled slightly on her well-maintained face. She said slowly, "Don't discuss this topic in the future." When Secretary Xun heard the calm words, he suddenly felt his body become a bit cold. He subconsciously looked out the window, but he found that the window was tightly closed. No wind blew in. Of course, it was already late spring. Even if the night wind blew in, it would only be warm. His sudden cold was only because his mood affected his senses. Su Li's secret was only known by the 3 people in the car in the Federation. Xun Li knew that this represented the madam's absolute trust in him. What he said before was very inappropriate. Lady Tai turned her head and looked out the window at the familiar streets of the capital. She had lived in this city, the core of the Federation's power, for many years. She had never truly gotten close to this core of power, but this core of power was constantly under her influence. Only today did she suddenly realize that the current president of the Federation was indeed a person with a strong will. It was not easy to not influence him. Su Li's secret was Feng Yu's secret. In the madam's eyes, it was also her secret. She originally didn't want to share this secret with anyone. This was very interesting. It was probably like a little girl treasuring her fake jewelry box. But now she knew that if she didn't reveal this secret, it seemed that she wouldn't be able to kill Su Lu. At the inauguration ceremony 5 months ago, she and the Bureau of Proclamation almost simultaneously learned that Su Lu had entered the S2 mountain surrounded by mountains foundation building. After a short period of consideration, She wrote down a faint foreshadowing at the first moment. Secretary Bai, who had found an opportunity to return the information at the mountaintop, quietly left. Su Li's detailed plan revealed the most fatal flaw. However, under such circumstances, that brat named Su Lu was still able to kill him. This fact made Lady Tai vigilant, angry, and a little disappointed. Therefore, she had to kill Su Lu. The silence in the car continued until they entered the back of Macho Mountain. The moment Secretary Shun opened the car door for the madam, he saw the firm expression on the madam's face. Thinking of the conversation in the president's official residence, he suddenly understood what the madam wanted to do. Su Lu had to die. If the president first granted amnesty, and then the madam threw that bomb through the Bureau of Proclamation, the government and the military would definitely be rendered speechless. Lady Tai definitely didn't have the extravagant hope of controlling a Federation president, but at least she wanted the president to have enough respect for her. This kind of arrangement was, without a doubt, the most understated but powerful method. Secretary Shun held an umbrella and accompanied the madam as they walked through the fine spring rain toward the mountain villa. The respect in his heart rose spontaneously like the rain. The mountain rain was about to fall to the ground when a gust of wind blew into the building. The dispute over this matter among the upper echelons of the Federation was strictly controlled within an extremely small circle of knowledge. However, that night, President Pabre and Lady Tai had an unfruitful conversation. Apart from the Westwoods Zhong family, the other 6 families, as well as their partners and stakeholders within the government, all began to make their own moves. Although the amnesty process wasn't terminated, it was still abnormally difficult to proceed. Faced with the pressure from the 1,000-year-old families of the Federation, even General Meyer seemed to feel the difficulty. During a phone call with Zhou, he somewhat angrily expressed his pessimistic views and worries about this matter. Although the president and the military had enough confidence, no one knew what the madam was thinking. Perhaps she held secrets that outsiders didn't know. Otherwise, with the madam's political wisdom, there was no way she would oppose the president granting amnesty to Su Lu. It should be known that everyone knew that Su Lu had always had a close relationship with the Tai family. Everyone wanted to kill him. The Federation was completely silent. In this oppressive atmosphere, a black car slowly stopped in front of the entrance of Qingcheng Military Prison. A thin and weak major walked out of the car. Beside him was a beautiful woman in a white dress. The soldiers of the military prison looked at the man and woman at the entrance as if they were looking at 2 idiots. They actually wanted to visit a serious criminal of the Federation? Could it be that they didn't know what kind of people were locked up in Qingcheng Military Prison? There had never been such heartwarming stories of visits happening here. However, the soldiers in charge of security forgot that if they really were 2 idiots, how could they possibly find the true location of Qingcheng Military Prison? Chapter 312. It had been many years since a visitor had come to Qingcheng Military Prison. The soldiers in charge of security looked at the man and woman at the door with a strange expression. Before the sarcasm in their eyes could melt away, they were shocked and suspicious when they saw the file handed to them by the young major. The officer who came after hearing the news looked through the file seriously with a headache. He found that these thick files were indeed written authorizations jointly issued by the Ministry of National Defense, the 1st Military Region, and the Ministry of Justice. However, he did not dare to make the decision. After all, this prison was completely different from other prisons in the Federation. For many years there had been no visitation rules. Among the strict security measures, there were no regulations for visitation. Although the thin and weak young major in front of him followed the relevant regulations of the Federation, the military prison had not encountered such a situation for many years. The officer could not confirm that these procedures were legal and reasonable. He did not have the courage to welcome the first visitor to Qingcheng Military Prison in many years just by relying on these documents. The news of a visitor to the prison was reported up the chain of command until it reached the warden level. Not long after, the soldiers at the gate of the military prison were surprised to see a fat warden in a military uniform running all the way to the entrance. Qingcheng Military Prison had a special status. The warden was treated as a major general. The military uniform worn by the warden was clearly marked with his medal and rank. The fat warden rushed in front of the thin young officer. Thinking of the phone call he had received earlier, He subconsciously wanted to salute the young officer. But then he remembered that the young officer was only a major after all. His right hand that was about to be raised dropped unnaturally. The warden took out a handkerchief and carefully wiped the sweat on his forehead. He said to the young major in a low voice, "Major Yuan, I just received a call from you. I didn't have time to prepare. Please excuse me." Although the warden was treated as a major general, he had been guarding the military prison in the wasteland for many years. In fact, he was just a marginal figure in the military. Today, he suddenly welcomed an important guest who could change his life. He could not help but feel a little excited and flustered. Even though he was excited and panicked, he still had to follow the procedures. The federal military had always been strict in terms of discipline. The young major with a special identity also knew this. After smiling, he handed the documents that he had checked earlier to the warden. A few minutes later, the soldiers and officials at the main entrance of Qingcheng military prison watched as the warden personally welcomed the young man and woman into the prison. The shock in their hearts was indescribable. They couldn't help but wonder who on earth had come to receive such treatment and authority. Taiziyuan's Special Forces team was transferred back to S1 to rest and reorganize after completing the secret mission assigned by the Bureau of Proclamation. A few days ago, the entire team represented the 2nd Military Region and participated in the Federation's anti-terrorism exercise. Because of his excellent performance in the exercise and the overall score of the General Staff Headquarters, he was promoted to Major by the Ministry of Defense. Following the warden in the long and dark tunnel, he lowered his head and looked at the clear magnetic material of the tunnel under his feet. A trace of indescribable emotion appeared on his slightly pale face. He wondered how that guy was doing after being locked up here. The Tai family had a terrifying influence that no one in the Federation had ever truly encountered. Whether it was the government or the other families of the 7 major families, they all maintained enough respect and vigilance towards this family of the former dynasty that did not have a prosperous population. As the young master of the Tai family, he had enough power to break some of the Federation's rules. However, he had always been a citizen of the Federation and maintained respect for the laws of the Federation's charter. Therefore, this time when he came to Qingcheng military prison, he spent a full month to apply for the complicated review documents. The laws of the Federation did not prohibit visits in military prisons. Taiziyuan took advantage of this. However, the problem was that he knew very well that this was unprecedented. Whether it was the Ministry of Defense or the Ministry of Justice, those officials had somewhat reluctantly approved his application because there was a tie in the applicant's name at the end of the document. Even the warden who was leading the way in front of him was the same. If it wasn't for that phone call, even if he came with a few lawyers of the Federation, how could he enter Qingcheng military prison? Thinking of this, Taiziyuan's expression calmed down a little. There was only a long table in the room and a few chairs fixed to the ground. The walls were made of alloy, and the ground was mixed with magnetic material of the tunnel. Taiziyuan asked the beautiful lady beside him to sit down first. Then, he sat on his own chair and silently waited for that guy to appear. While waiting, he thought of the strict security measures he had seen along the way. He couldn't help but feel a little speechless. As a God's favored child, although he had also experienced the baptism of blood and fire in Huanshan 4 states, this was the first time he carried out such a sinister destruction of freedom. It was inevitable that he felt a little strange. Not long after, along with the dull sound of metal colliding and the sound of shackles dragging on the ground, Su Lu, whose freedom of movement was strangled by various security devices, followed behind the warden. He slowly and painstakingly walked into the room. Sulu looked at the man and woman across the table. His footsteps suddenly froze in place. When he received the notice from the prison, he thought it was a follow-up interrogation by the Federation Investigation Bureau, or that Su Songzi had come again to report some information. However, he didn't expect that the person who came today was a pure visitor. It was the guy he hadn't seen in a long time. Sulu looked at Taiziyuan across the table, shook his head with a smile and sat down. During this process, the smile on his face was in full bloom. It was incomparably joyful and sincere. Coupled with his smiling eyes, he looked somewhat cute and silly. Taiziyuan stared at the smiling Sulu in front of him. His face was cold and indifferent. After a while, He said seriously to the warden general, "Can I talk to him alone?" This didn't seem to be in accordance with the regulations. However, Qingcheng prison didn't seem to have any regulations regarding visits. The point was that the warden knew very well that Su Lu was an extremely dangerous person. He really didn't feel safe leaving the crown prince and that delicate beauty alone in the same space with this person. If something happened, how could he explain to the Tai family, to the military, and to the president? Therefore, even though the warden was very happy to hear the crown prince call him general, he still hesitated and didn't immediately agree. "I have a good relationship with him. I don't think he's crazy enough to kill me," Taizong said calmly. The warden pondered for a moment and said, "Okay, but the prison will monitor and record the whole process. I hope you understand." "Thank you." Taizong bowed slightly to express his gratitude. There were only 3 people left in the room. It was the first time the enchanting beauty had come to such a place. Her gentle eyes were filled with curiosity and nervousness. She timidly looked at the young prisoner across the table who was wearing handcuffs and leg shackles. She felt that she had seen him somewhere before. But what she thought more was, what kind of vicious and evil person was this person? He was actually locked up in such a dark place by the Federation. Why did this noble person beside her come to visit him? And why did she have to bring her along? The 2 young men in the room didn't care about this girl's thoughts. They only looked at each other. The smile on Su Li's face grew wider and wider. In the end, he actually laughed out loud and kept shaking his head. He seemed to be extremely happy. Looking at this scene, Taizong's face grew colder and colder. He didn't know where the anger came from, but it made him suddenly slam the table. He pointed at Su Li's face and forced out a cold growl from between his teeth. "Stop laughing like an idiot." Su Lu looked at him somewhat innocently. He tried his best to hide the smile that came from his heart, but the corners of his lips were still curled up stubbornly. He could suppress his smile, but he couldn't suppress his happiness. "Laugh, laugh, laugh. Do you only know how to squint and laugh like an idiot your whole life?" Taizong stared into his eyes and said coldly, "You're going to die. How can you still laugh? You've really laughed until you become an idiot. You really aren't afraid of things like death. Do you know the consequences of this matter? How many people in the Federation want you dead? The 7 great families, the government, the Senate, those big shots are actually just a bunch of idiots. They only know how to pretend to be calm, to kill with a flick of their fingers. In reality, they're all just a bunch of idiots played by Macklin." He raised his head and looked into Su Li's eyes. He said seriously, "They were played to death by Macklin. In the end, you played Macklin to death. And the reason you used was so simple and direct. Your existence is a slap to their faces. And they've always been afraid of people like you. What are you thinking? You actually single-handedly killed an S2. Who do you think you are? Li Pifu?" The more Taizong thought about this bizarre matter, the angrier he got. He slammed the table angrily and said sternly, "What exactly is in your brain? The pear blossoms and snow from Yue University have all been stuffed into your brain. You only know about romance?" Su Lu stuttered and objected. This matter did not seem to have anything to do with romance. If it's not romance, then it's white clothes whiter than snow. With an ancient sword in hand, you want to protect the peace of the universe and the justice of the world? Taizong waved his hand and said angrily, "Zhang Xiaoming is not dead. What the hell does Macklin have to do with you?" The beautiful girl beside him looked at Taizong in shock. She had not seen him many times, and this was the first time she saw him so angry. She could not help but be even more confused about the real relationship between Taizong and the prisoner. "Today I'm here to ask you one thing. You went to kill Macklin. How much of it was because of the crime he committed? Or is it that subconsciously, you still want to prove something to Zhang Xiaoming? You want to prove that you're more violent, more revolutionary, and more righteous than the anti-government forces? Don't say that Macklin killed people, but the Federation's laws are useless against him, so you want to enforce justice on behalf of the heavens. He deserved to die, but what about you? How many people did you kill in the Foundation building? How many people died in the Federation's riots in the past few months?" Taizong's face was slightly pale. He stared into his eyes and said, "This universe does not need such a hero. You should not be such a lonely hero. You are not a hero. You are not even a good person. Maybe you just like the feeling of killing people. Taizion raised his hands and said mockingly, "What do the soldiers who know about the training base say about you after seeing the surveillance video of the Foundation building? A cold-blooded killer." Subconsciously, Zhang Xiaoming, cold-blooded? The smile on Su Li's lips gradually disappeared. He quietly looked at Taizion across the table. He narrowed his eyes and seriously recalled his thoughts at that time. He confirmed that his starting point was very simple and did not need to discuss psychology. Only then did he let out a sigh of relief. From the moment Su Lu entered the room, Taizion never stopped talking. He did not give him a chance to refute. Su Lu also tactfully kept silent because he knew where Taizion's anger came from. Of course, he also knew that this friend he had not seen for a long time could enter the heavily guarded military prison. Naturally, it was not just to vent his anger by scolding him from afar. In fact, when he saw the beautiful girl in a white dress beside Taizion, Su Lu felt something. That girl was Bai Qi, the former top girl of the Linhai Star Club and Taizion's first woman. These represented that Su Lu and Taizion were not that distant, but they felt like distant memories. Taizion brought Bai Qi here to show Su Lu how nostalgic he was. After a long silence, a sincere smile appeared on Su Li's face again. He looked at Taizion and asked seriously, "Are you done scolding? Do you feel better?" Taizion looked at the bright smile on his face and waved his hand in annoyance. "Almost. Then I'll say a few words." Su Lu said with a smile, "I'm an orphan. My childhood was probably unimaginable to you, so don't look at me all the time. Sometimes when I'm impulsive, I become the ferocious young man I used to be. I don't even blink when I kill people. When I was locked up in Fox Castle for a few months, no one talked to me. I often talked to myself. Come to think of it, I'm definitely not the good person that I once wanted to be. Yes, I'm a murderer now. In fact, I was already a murderer when I was in my teens. But murderers can also have their own moral standards, although the term moral standards sounds a little too mysterious." Su Lu looked at Taizion's face and said seriously. If Taizion had not come to see him personally, he might not have bothered to say these words to anyone. He really did not need to explain what he did. He just wanted to explain it to his trusted friends. Killing Macklin has nothing to do with Zhang Xiaoming. It has nothing to do with the terrorist attack at the concert. It doesn't even have much to do with the innocent victims. I just want to do something that meets my own standards. Su Lu said seriously, "Every time I think of breathing the air that Macklin once breathed, I feel unduly depressed. I want to meet my own standards. I want to have fun." Taizion lowered his head and listened to what he said seriously. Finally, he could not help but smile faintly and said, "You're having fun. What about the others?" Su Lu was about to say something with a smile when Taizion gave Bai Qi a look and asked her to walk out of the office. He was slightly stunned. He raised his eyebrows that were like flying knives and asked curiously, "This girl, has she been raised by you since that day?" As expected of the young master of the Tai family. If everyone spent their nights like you, the Federation would be in chaos. Supply and demand would be completely unbalanced. This was not a funny joke. Of course, Taizion did not laugh. The reason why Su Lu said this was because he saw the solemn expression between Taizion's brows. He knew that an extremely serious topic was about to begin. Subconsciously, he wanted to dilute the atmosphere. Taizion stood up, walked to his side and whispered a few words. Su Li's expression suddenly changed. "After you were arrested, you must have suffered a lot in prison. Take care of yourself more. You don't have to take off your clothes to show off the scars on your body." Taizion gently pressed his shoulder. Feeling that he had lost a lot of weight, he could not help but feel a little sad. At this moment, Su Lu was still immersed in shock. It was not until now that he learned the whole truth from Taizion. Macklin was actually a spy for the Empire. This ridiculous fact made him unable to recover for a moment, and he did not listen to Taizion's words. "I'll leave first. Don't worry." After saying this, Taizion walked out of the room. Su Lu stood up with some difficulty and nodded at him. There was no need for too many words between the two of them to understand each other's intentions. Seeing that the alloy door of the room was closed, Su Li's lips curved into a smile. It was really a blessing to have a few friends in this world. Immediately after, the smile on his lips bloomed. With a trace of disbelief and a trace of absurdity, He laughed loudly in the quiet room. His laughter reverberated in the room, colliding back and forth. Macklin was a spy for the Empire. After hearing this shocking news, Sulu did not feel any pride in saving the fate of the Federation, nor did he think that he was some kind of hero. This was because his logic had always been too lazy to touch on these aspects. He only thought happily, good kill. Behind the Macho Mountain beside the Macho Lake. On the balcony, Lady Tai slowly turned around. Her calm and gentle face did not change at all. She asked, "What did he say on the phone?" Big Secretary Shen hesitated for a moment, then immediately repeated truthfully, "Young master has already left Qingcheng prison. He said on the phone that we should figure out how many lives the person locked up in there had saved him. What can he use to repay him?" Upon hearing this, a complicated expression flashed across Lady Tai's face. There was some comfort, some anger and some indifference. After a moment, she said softly, "Send the materials to the Bureau of Proclamation tomorrow." Xin Li's heart turned cold. He did not know if Madam and young master would turn against each other because of this matter, but he did not dare to raise any opinions. He nodded and left the balcony. At this moment, Butler Jean walked over with a solemn expression and handed the phone in his hand to Lady Tai. This was Lady Tai's private phone number. Less than 10 people in the entire Federation knew this number. Lady Tai did not take the phone. She turned around and looked at the beautiful scenery on the sorrowless lake. She said lightly, "I said, don't answer Yuan's call. It's not young master's call." Butler Jin's voice was slightly nervous. He had been by Madam's side for decades and had seen countless important events and figures in the Federation. However, he still felt uneasy when he thought of this call. He lowered his voice and said, "It's from Philadelphia." Chapter 313. Regardless of whether it was the old man who was fishing by the Snow Mountain Lake in Philadelphia, or the lady who was drinking afternoon tea by the Macho-Back Mountain Lake in the suburbs of the capital, to the Federation, they were not ordinary people. The ordinary people here were not just ordinary people. All these years, the old man had been sitting by the lake, not because he wanted to show the whole Federation that he did not care about fame and fortune. In fact, the glory of the Federation was all gathered on him. He was the army god who was respected by thousands of people. The division commanders, regiment commanders, battalion commanders, and soldiers under his command were now generals who held real power in the federal military. Fame and fortune were like floating clouds in the sky to this old man in Philadelphia. He had once picked them up with his fingers, so he knew that they were not fake, but they were also not that important. The lady in the Macho-Back Mountain Lake was the same. Just like the attitude of the 7 major families for thousands of years, she had always been smiling calmly and silently behind the scenes, looking at the turbulent situation on the stage. She knew more than anyone else. Her slender fingers could easily pick up a piece of old history, which could be a secret that could not be found in the Federation. The family she controlled had always been low-key and silent. Even many years ago, when the government and the 7 major families were like fire and water, the Tai family still calmly suppressed all the power that was hidden in the dark. Who knew what kind of power that family of thousands of years old would erupt once it broke out? When a butterfly flapped its wings, it could create a hurricane on the other side of the sea. The army god in Philadelphia, the lady in the Macho-Back Mountain Lake, was not a small and weak butterfly, but a rock that flew above the 9 heavens, flying through the light of the stars. If people like them really moved, the wind would be very difficult to stop. The content of the contact between these two big figures was usually not that important. Instead, the time of contact between them could reveal some very important signals. Lady Tai took the exquisite black phone and walked to the edge of the terrace. There was a polite smile on her calm face, as if she could see the old man on the other end of the phone. Before the new year, when Madame Tai found out that General Li had the intention of matchmaking the young lady and the young master of the Li family, she specially made a trip to Feiqing City and had a meal with the old man. Since then, the two had not seen each other. However, at this time the old man actually called her personally. Madame Tai did not need to ponder for too long to understand the meaning behind it. Lady Tai smiled and said something into the phone. Then she hung up the phone. She held the green stone of the terrace with both hands and stared at the slightly dark lake and mountains in a daze. There were some things that she could understand, but there were some that she couldn't. She believed that she had already revealed enough information when she smiled on the phone. However, there were some things that could only be explained thoroughly when they met. Army God was an official title of the Federation government. It was not a magical description that was passed down by word of mouth. Although the old man had been silent for a long time, no one dared to underestimate his influence in the Federation. Therefore, when some people knew that the army god had left Feiqing City and was heading to the capital special district, they were shocked and puzzled. In front of the entrance of the Linyuan, there were some figures of the special task force behind the dense trees. The black official vehicles of the Investigation Bureau of the Federation also showed their presence at the intersection not far away. However, there were more than a dozen military vehicles which were painted in camouflage and dark green. There were more than a dozen of them parked along the road in front of the entrance of the Linyuan. The air was filled with the unique chill of a military camp. The old man never wanted to trouble the Federation government. But since the government knew that he was coming, of course, they had to show enough sincerity and attention. As for the officers of the Ministry of National Defense and the 1st Military Region, they followed the strictest orders of their superiors and surrounded the Linyuan. They had to ensure that the old man was not disturbed by irrelevant people. However, it seemed that they did not need to do these things, because the Linyuan was not accepting guests today. The owner of the Linyuan, who used to travel through the Federation like a shadow and rarely appeared in front of people, was wearing a dark green suit today. He stood at the entrance of the Linyuan with a smile on his face. He politely but coldly blocked all the prying eyes, and even refused the request of Director Brin from the president's residence to enter. Lin Banshan, the most famous son of the 7 families and the top figure in the Federation, was like a doorman today. He stood at the entrance with his mountain-like shoulders and smiled like a doorman. In this Federation, there was probably only one person who could let Lin Banshan guard the door. When he was young, he had seen the old man, but he never thought that the old man would actually live in his place when he returned to the capital for the first time in all these years. The sense of achievement he felt when he swept through the underground world of Bermuda was not as good as today. He smiled and sent Director Brin out of the door, and then whispered a few words to the logistics director of the 1st Military Region, who had a distressed expression, before he closed the door of the Linyuan tightly. Except for the bamboo house next to the hall, there was not a single guest in the Linyuan. Lady Tai picked up a piece of light red tongluo fish and dipped it in a little rosemary sauce. She steadily put it on the Guna porcelain plate opposite her and said with a smile, "Lin Banshan is really bold. He dares to release the news that you are coming to the capital. This way, those old guys who are already afraid of him will be even more afraid of him." "I like bold young people," the old man said with a smile. Ever since he no longer held the position of Grand Marshal, he had never worn a military uniform again. Today, he was wearing an extremely simple set of casual clothes. His hair was white, and his old and thin body appeared even shorter because of his sitting posture. Compared to the young and tall grandson behind him, the passion and grief of life could be seen at a glance. No one would be able to associate him with his illustrious military exploits and the shocking act of assassinating the empire's emperor. Li Feng, who was wearing a lieutenant colonel uniform, stood behind the old man with his hands behind his back. The usual craziness and violence were gone, and there was only calmness and honesty. He really looked like a boy in puberty, and not the terrifying madman Li. In this world, the only person he feared and respected, and didn't dare to have the slightest rebellious thoughts, was not his father, but his grandfather, the old and thin old man in front of him. Madame Tai quietly looked at the age spots on the edge of the old man's eyebrows. Thinking about the past few decades, watching the once arrogant war god gradually grow old, she couldn't help but have some indescribable complex feelings. The old man casually waved his hand. Li Feng saluted with a bang, walked out of the bamboo house, and walked out of the gate of Linyuan. Leaving his grandfather's side, the piercing cold ruthlessness that rose to the sky returned to him. He coldly stared at the cars outside of Linyuan, feeling a little annoyed. Lin Banshan, who had been standing at the gate of Linyuan, smiled and lit a cigarette. He handed one over, but it was rejected by Li Feng. "Sir Military God came here this time for that guy, right?" Lin Banshan didn't care. With his hands behind his back, he leisurely said, Madmanly, it's useless to be annoyed. If even military god likes that guy, you can only be annoyed forever in this life. There were only 2 people left in the bamboo house, 2 people who were qualified to stand in the clouds and watch the destruction and rebirth of the stars. In fact, many years ago, they often sat opposite each other like now, discussing and deciding many things. But at that time, there was a president and a director of the Bureau of Proclamation beside them. But those 2 partners had died, and there were only 2 of them left in the world. It was inevitable that they were lonely. It was little Feng who told me. Otherwise, although I also watched the news on TV, I didn't know that this matter had something to do with my family. The old man looked at Lady Tai and slowly said, "Since that little guy called Sulu has something to do with my family, I have to pay some attention to him." Hearing this, Lady Tai easily analyzed the cause and effect. She lowered her head and said with a smile, "I have taken care of Yuzi for so many years, but in the end I still don't know her well." It was unknown how much coldness and indifference there was in this sigh, but this lady wasn't stupid enough to put on airs in front of the old man. She just sighed and said, "Sulu has something to do with your family, but it's related to him. Although I don't want to admit it, it seems that Sulu is the only descendant of my younger brother left in this universe." "Descendant? Isn't Muzi his daughter?" said Lady Tai. "I brought Muzi up. Although she has inherited her brother's rebellious nature, she is still a girl after all. And she hasn't even seen her biological father, so she hasn't inherited anything from him. But Sulu is different." The old man's voice was a bit light. He said slowly, "I am old and he is dead. But I found that he had a student who inherited most of his abilities. It seems that the living me and the dead him can find some way to see each other." The 2 brothers, one old and one dead, couldn't see each other again. The old man's words were simple and clear, but there was also a bit of sadness. Lady Tai listened quietly, and the corners of her eyes twitched slightly. She gently pressed the silk scarf on his forehead. After a moment of silence, she said slowly, "Back then, because he broke the glory of the charter, we discussed something with the president. Have you forgotten? He is your biological younger brother, and you have never hesitated. Why do you have a different opinion today?" She said with slight mockery, "Is it because you are old and your heart has softened? Why was your heart so hard back then?" The old man looked at Lady Tai quietly. He thought about the secret meeting at the president's official residence that year. He thought about the time when this lady was still a young girl. He thought about the previous head of the Tai family, the complicated relationship between her and his younger brother. He thought about how her eyes were slightly red when she signed her name on behalf of the Tai family. He couldn't help but sigh softly in his heart. He didn't pay attention to the rare sharpness in her words. It was probably only in front of this old man that Madame Cheung would reveal some of her true feelings. "He is different from this little guy," the old man said slowly in an old voice. "Personality determines fate. My younger brother was born cold and heartless. If the Bureau of Proclamation hadn't been tracking him down and suppressing him for the past few decades, who knows how many people would have died because of him. But this little guy is different. He made great contributions to the Federation. I checked his files for the past 2 years. I really admire this little guy's personality. Back then, he also made great contributions to the Federation." Lady Tai looked coldly at the old man in front of her and said, "I don't think it suits your personality to decide the Federation's safety based on personality. He can affect the Federation's safety because he has the ability to break the glory of the Charter. Is that little guy really that dangerous?" Lady Tai lowered her head and poured a cup of tea for the old man. She said slowly, "The Federation has already determined that Sulu from Donglin is dead, but he is alive and well in front of me. You should understand what this means." The old man coughed twice. The wrinkles on his face gradually smoothed out. He said, "I only recently found out about the relationship between Sulu and him. Li Feng has fought with him before, but he never told me. In my opinion, this little guy is just too unlucky to have met someone like my brother. He was carelessly brought into the earth trench. As for the matter of the chip, perhaps he exchanged it for this little guy when the Bureau of Proclamation was hunting him down 2 years ago. You are old after all." Lady Tai quietly studied the wrinkles on the old man's face. She said with a slight mocking tone like a younger sister, "Where did the war god, who was decisive in killing and would rather sacrifice his family for the sake of justice than let the Federation take any risk go. He actually used this kind of self-comforting reasoning to clear the name of a dangerous little guy? Of course. The old man said calmly, if Sulu knows everything that my younger brother knows, I won't object to you handing him over to the Bureau of Proclamation. How can you be sure of this? I'll go see him myself. Perhaps it was just as Lady Tai said with a slight mocking tone. The Federation's war god Li Pifu was old after all. When he found out from Li Feng that the person who assassinated Macklin was actually his student and seemed to have inherited all of his abilities, there were some ripples in his tranquil heart. If he was still alive, perhaps this old man would always be as tough as ice-cold iron. However, he was already dead, so the old man naturally took care of his descendant a bit more. The ripples that occasionally appeared in the war god's heart were, for the Federation, turbulent currents hidden under the jade-like surface of the sea. The old man was going to visit a serious criminal in Qingqing's military prison. The Ministry of Defense quickly sent out a special military plane and advance personnel, busily beginning to arrange everything. The old man's visit to Sulu in prison was more profound than the visit of the young master of the Tai family. The commotion it caused was even more shocking. From a certain perspective, this visit to Sulu determined his life with one glance. Life or death, it was all in this one glance. Sulu didn't know any of this. He was politely invited out of the single cell by the warden. Like a VIP guest, he bathed and ate before being brought into the interrogation room. He was originally a bit confused, but when he saw the thin old man across the long table and Madman Li standing behind the old man, he immediately determined the true identity of this old man. The orphan of Donglin was a rock that couldn't be swayed by anything. However, when he saw this legendary figure without any mental preparation, he was still so shocked that his face turned slightly pale. His lips trembled slightly, and he couldn't say anything for a long time. The strong mental impact made Sulu feel a bit dazed. He vaguely remembered the disdainful words of the uncle in the mine many years ago, and the guesses he had about the uncle's background in the past 2 years. He looked at the Federation's war god Li Pifu across the table in disbelief and subconsciously asked in a hoarse voice, "Old man?" Chapter 314. Several decades ago, Li Pifu had been the commander of the 17th Armored Division of the Federation's 1st Military Region. He had participated in the Federation's expedition against the Empire, assassinating the Empire's emperor and turning the tide. After that, he had commanded the Federal Army to fight like a god in the continuous battles that followed. He had made great contributions and became the undisputed #1 person in the military, and even the #1 person in the Federation. Ever since that black M37 mecha had swept across the battlefield like a mad dragon, amidst the encirclement of 200 Imperial Royal Mecha battalions, and killed the Emperor of the Empire, no one in this universe dared to call him by his name anymore. No matter where he appeared, he would always be greeted with passionate gazes of excitement and admiration. Because of a person like him, the Lees of Philadelphia, a normal citizen family, actually had some semblance of a 1,000-year-old family. Even the 7 great families with 10,000 years of heritage did not dare to slight him. The people of the Empire hatefully called him Beast, the people of the Federation respectfully called him War God, and successive presidents of the Federation politely called him Grand Marshal. Today, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the Federation, the commander of the 1st Military Region, General Miles, the commander of the 3rd Military Region, and many high-ranking officers in the Ministry of Defense and the fleet were all subordinates of this war god. For these high-ranking officers, they were not used to calling Li Pifu War God or Grand Marshal, because that would seem too distant and too weird. They had their own unique way of addressing him. For example, General Miles was used to calling him Teacher, General Hong Yuliang was used to calling him Teacher, and the former head of the Ministry of Defense was used to calling him Boss. These old subordinates also had a common name for Li Pifu, and this name was affectionate and respectful, and that was Old Man. However, today, in the military prison of Allure, when this young prisoner saw Li Pifu, he called him Old Man. Old Man and Old Man seemed to only have a difference of one word, but the meaning they represented was as different as heaven and earth. The Major General of the Ministry of National Defense and the Warden, who had accompanied the military god and his grandson into the prison, had a very interesting expression on their faces when they heard these words. They stared at Sulu, who was at the door, as if they would drag him out and shoot him at any time. However, Li Pifu, who was sitting across the table, did not have any reaction. The old man just quietly looked at the young man at the door. Gradually, a trace of emotion spread from his old face, and finally turned into a kind of understanding, slightly disappointed smile. How many years had it been since he heard this name? War god Li Pifu looked at this young man, but his thoughts drifted back to countless years ago. Ever since he was a child, he had always followed the rules and etiquette. Whether it was when he was in the Junior Military Academy in Philadelphia, or when he went to the other side of the universe with his younger brother to study under that teacher, he had always been so. Every step he took was cautious and he would never make a mistake. Li Pifu had always been cautious, but he was never muddle-headed. The only time he took an uncertain risk was when he assassinated the emperor of the empire. This kind of temperament, in the words of his younger brother, was that he was only 18 years old, but his mentality was already 80 years old. On your 18th birthday you started to call me old man, the old man quietly recalled in his heart. He could not help but sigh. From the two words old man, he finally confirmed the relationship between the young man in front of him and that guy. Sit down. The old man gestured for everyone in the room to leave, and then invited Sulu to sit down. Sulu sat down with the sound of the shackles, but he still felt that everything that happened today was somewhat unbelievable. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the military god across the table. He felt a bit like a year ago when he woke up in the hospital and saw Jian Shuer under the sun after waking up. It was just a dream, but he still saw the person who logically could only appear in dreams. When he saw Lady Tai for the first time at the back of Macho's mountain, Sulu was already incomparably nervous. After all, the 7 great Federation families were a distant and vague concept to him. However, the old man across the table was the object of worship for countless Federation citizens. There were several articles about him in the Federation's electronic basic education materials. These past few years, the Federation's publicity, movies and documentaries had already deeply rooted this person's image in the hearts of the people, and it was difficult to erase it. Sulu was no exception. Although he was a bit undisciplined, he still felt respect and fear for this great hero who had saved the Federation. These two complementary emotions came from his bones. How were his years in Donglin? Li Pifu looked at the somewhat nervous Sulu, and suddenly opened his mouth to ask a very abrupt question. At this time, all of the surveillance equipment in the interrogation room had been turned off. No matter how strict the rules of the military prison were, in front of Li Pifu, it was not a problem, and no one dared to pry into this strange conversation. This question was indeed very abrupt. Even if other people heard it, they might not understand it in a short time. But regarding this question, Sulu had thought about it for a very long time. Ever since he fought with Madman Li and Lin Yuan, he had been thinking about this. Suddenly, he was about to get the answer today. His lips couldn't help but dry slightly. A moment later, he said in a hoarse voice, "It's okay. He just drinks and eats meat every day. He opened an electrical repair shop, and every week he goes to the sanatorium to play. Yes, he likes to eat meat very much. But I never understood whether he liked the feeling of eating meat or the pleasure of destroying the Federation system." The old man sighed softly and said calmly, "You are his student." Sulu nervously scratched his head with his right hand. Although the old man in front of him was wearing casual clothes and looked old and frail, he felt that there was an abnormally solemn mood in the room that was squeezing the air in his brain. Perhaps it was because of the old man's name and history. Sulu felt that there was an abnormally solemn mood in the room that was squeezing the air in his brain. "I am a repairman in the shop. I don't know if I count as a student." He raised his head and said somewhat helplessly, "He passed on the most precious thing of the Li family to you, and you learned it. Naturally, you are his student." The old man's eyes were calm, but they were soul-stirring. He slowly said, "What do you call him? Precious thing of the Lis of Philadelphia?" Suli's heart tightened slightly. He secretly wondered whether this referred to the power in his body or the bangle on his left wrist. Would the war god take back his family's things? Ever since he entered the interrogation room, He had deliberately hidden the bangle on his left hand. At this time he even subconsciously put it under the table. I call him Uncle Fengyu. The old man was silent for a long time. Then he slowly said, I thought that since you have been with him for so long, you should at least know something. His name is not Fengyu, nor is it Yu Feng. His surname is Li, and he is my younger brother. Even though he had already prepared himself and speculated, when he heard the war god personally confirm that the uncle who had taught him for many years really had such a close relationship with the Lis of Philadelphia, Sulu could not help but feel shocked and hesitant. His left hand, which was hidden under the table, began to tremble uncontrollably. This was not because he was preparing to attack, but because there was an indescribable feeling. 10 valiant close-range combat postures, and the strange power in his body that was generated because of these postures. These were the things that Sulu could not understand when he valiantly charged into the capital ring and broke through the sky. But at this moment he suddenly found the answer. At this moment, he thought of the disdain of the uncle when he mentioned the war god that everyone revered. He also thought of many things. He also thought of when he fought with Lin Dohai's elite bodyguards under the Gongdu Hotel. When the powerful person called Kongwu was injured and fell to the ground, he was extremely terrified. Your surname is Li. Your surname is not Su. You are a member of the Li family. Sulu sat at the table and put his trembling left hand on his leg. He lowered his head and thought back to Kongwu's terrified expression that day. How operatic that was. However, the uncle's past had affected his present. How much did it sound like Schiller's absurd early-stage opera? How was he during those years in Donglin? Was he happy? Just as Sulu was in a state of shock, the old man's indifferent and nostalgic words once again rang out in the quiet room, pulling him out of that indescribable emotion. He raised his head and looked seriously at the war god's aged face for the first time. He wanted to connect this most famous face in the Federation with Uncle Fengyu's face. Not bad. Just a toothache. His teeth are basically all broken, Sulu replied softly. After Li Pifu heard this, his aged face dimmed slightly. He paused for a moment to reminisce, then he recovered his calm. He asked lightly, Can I trouble you to tell me the specifics of his life in Donglin? I'm more interested in this. In Fengyu's words, Sulu was born with the ability to see through people's hearts. That was because his nature was too simple, direct and clean, so the appearance of others was not an obstacle for him. Even though the person sitting across the table today was the most respectable person in the Federation, after calming down for a moment, Sulu understood what the old man needed the most. After a moment of silence, he began to quietly describe the uncle's life in Zhonglo Street and the mine. For example, the uncle's laziness, the uncle's gluttony, what brand of red wine the uncle liked to drink, how well his beef was fried, how much he liked to watch 23rd Uncle Dao's TV series, and that little girl with a head full of purple hair the most. The interrogation room was completely silent. Only Su Li's slightly hoarse voice could be heard as he described the ordinary life of a level 1 fugitive from the Federation. The old man and Lieutenant Colonel Li Feng behind him listened silently the entire time. Only at the end did the old man say with emotion, The stars are easy to fall into disorder, but one's nature is hard to change. After all these years, the things he likes are still the same. I just didn't expect that with his temperament, he could actually endure so many years of loneliness. When he heard that Fengyu liked that little girl with purple hair the most, the old man didn't express any opinion. However, Li Feng behind him frowned slightly. No matter how plain and complicated the story was, there was always an end. The room was silent for a long time. Li Pifu looked at Sulu and suddenly asked directly and simply, Is the star map in your hands? This question came very suddenly. After the warm and emotional narration of the long memories, it was like a brush stroke from the heavens, giving rise to a biting cold feeling. Chapter 3:15. After all, the war god was not a real god. As an old man, his hatred for that brother of his who had cut ties with him decades ago gradually faded and was replaced by nostalgia, which led to this conversation and reminiscence. While recounting Uncle Fengyu's life in Donglin, Sulu could not help but be immersed in the memories of his youth. Sad or happy, most of them were plain learning, training and reading, but they were the times he cherished the most. After escaping from Donglin, as a fugitive, Sulu did not have many opportunities to talk about his past with others. Today, in front of this old man, this was the first time he could slowly narrate without any psychological barriers, so it was inevitable that he was immersed. Just as he was immersed in a warm state, he was shocked by the sudden question. He subconsciously raised his head and met the old man's eyes. In this moment, the old man's eyes no longer held any emotion or nostalgia, much less any warmth or kindness. They were as calm as a mirror, as cold as ice, and as sharp as a knife. They cut through the space of the interrogation room and pierced deeply into Sulu's eyes. In the past, Sulu had only heard of gazes as sharp as knives in literature. Only today did he know that this description was actually true. In this world, there really were people whose gazes could be so sharp that they seemed tangible. Because this person was called Li Pifu. This person had once stood above tens of thousands of people, watching the black clouds bloom on the planet, watching the wreckage of battleships scatter among the stars, watching the severed limbs and bloody corpses on the battlefield, and seeing the flower-like Mecca. He had once, at the closest distance, seen the stunned and gloomy eyes of an emperor of an empire before he died. This kind of person, this kind of gaze, the condensation of countless years of life and death, the wisdom of strategy, and the piercing killing intent that soared to the heavens, how could a normal person bear it? Sulu only felt that he was suddenly in the coldest winter day in Linhai province, his entire body naked. Then he was splashed with a basin of cold water from head to toe. Finally, a cold knife pierced between his eyebrows, freezing his brain and hurting his spine until his nerves were numb. He could not summon any thoughts of resistance or the courage to lie. What star chart? In the ice cellar, he subconsciously answered in a daze. Then, relying on his strong nerves and instinct to not lower his head under the pressure, he slowly returned to normal and felt a trace of warmth begin to accumulate in his heart. Feicheng Li Pifu, who was this kind of person? At first, he warmly reminisced about the past, but in the silence, a clap of thunder sounded in the biting cold. During the conversation, he meticulously and perfectly displayed the commanding wisdom that he had once used on the battlefield, in order to get the truest answer from Sulu. The old man quietly looked at Sulu's eyes. He noticed that there was fear in the young man's slightly narrowed eyes, but it quickly turned into calmness. There was confusion, but it soon turned into doubt. However, there was no trace of strangeness or concealment. He knew that the young man was indeed like what he said subconsciously. He did not know what the star atlas was. Hearing this answer, the old man's expression was slightly gloomy. He seemed to be a bit disappointed, but a gratified look flashed in his eyes. It was really puzzling that all kinds of contradictions would appear in the body of the Federation's god of war, who was as unmoving as a mountain. What exactly was the so-called star atlas? The sudden questioning that seemed to come from the sky did not end. Before Sulu completely got rid of this confusion, the old man slightly raised his eyes. The sharp light in his eyes suddenly appeared and then disappeared. He stuck out the tip of his tongue and forced out an old and hoarse voice from his dry lips. It was like two claps of thunder. Do you know how to change the chip? The god of war Li Pifu was already old. When his thin and old body sat on the chair, he looked like a very ordinary old man. However, at this moment when he suddenly asked the question, a shocking aura surged out of his body, making people feel that his body was suddenly tall and mighty. The most terrifying thing was that the hoarse voice that came out of his dry lips suddenly became so loud and clear. It repeatedly collided in the quiet interrogation room, rumbling like thunder in spring, as if it would never stop. Do you know how to change the chip? This question sounded simple and straightforward. It was like asking Sulu if he knew how to repair electrical appliances. Do you know how to cook? It was even a bit funny. However, when it came out of the old man's mouth, it was not funny at all. Sulu felt that his eardrums were a bit painful from the vibrations. His mind was also a bit muddled. He subconsciously thought of the first time he met Madman Li in Linyuan. This guy also spoke with a buzzing voice, as if there were hundreds of little people in his chest uniformly beating drums. The fact that he had the extra energy to think about these questions proved that Sulu was not shocked by the god of war's sudden question. At the very beginning, if the imposing old man across the table had asked this question, in his days, even if Sulu dared to hide the truth, The emotions in his eyes and some small movements of his body would have been seen through by the other. However, Li Pifu had asked about the star map. Sulu really did not know what a star map was, so he did not lie and safely passed the first question. He had stronger nerves and a stronger will than the average person, so he woke up faster. After the first question, a strong sense of wariness rose in his heart. His eyes were still dazed, but his left hand under the table was already clenched tightly, forcibly controlling every pair of muscle fibers in his body so that the corners of his eyes, brows, and lips would not tremble in the slightest. That depends on what kind of verification chip it is. If it's related to mecha and self-propelled armored vehicles, I'm more proficient, but I'm not very familiar with warship systems. Sulu rubbed his forehead and began to answer the old man's questions. At first, he was still a little dazed from the shock, but gradually, he became much more natural. In the end, he frowned and looked across the table, asking curiously, "What exactly do you want to ask?" When Li Pifu's aged voice exploded like spring thunder, Li Feng, who had been standing behind him with his hands clasped behind his back, frowned. He lowered his head and lowered his eyes, forcing himself to maintain his composure. He knew the secret of his grandfather's ability to look down on the universe, because this was originally the secret of the Lees of Philadelphia. However, this was also the first time he had learned that his grandfather could actually use that power in his body so miraculously. He could release it without using his own body. A trace of daze flashed through Li Feng's lowered eyes. His father had not embarked on the path of cultivation, so he was probably the person closest to his grandfather. However, when would he be able to reach this level? Was there anyone else in the universe who could be so powerful? That granduncle whom he had never met, but whom his father revered so much. Could he do this? Everyone had their own days. Sulu did not know what Madman Li was thinking right now. Otherwise, he would definitely have told him that back in the day, Uncle Feng Yu had once taken off his armor with his bare hands in the forest on the outskirts of Heshi province. That kind of level, just like the old man in the room today, was not something a normal human could do. Sulu was only thinking that there should not be any problems with his reaction. The real reason why his uncle was listed as a level 1 fugitive by the Preamble Bureau, the big secret that could break the glory of the charter, should perhaps be able to continue being kept by him by luck. However, Li Pifu only looked at him and said lightly, "You're lying." There was a suffocating silence in the interrogation room. Li Pifu looked calmly at Sulu and said, "To be able to change into a completely new identity, other than your teacher, only you can do this. I only want to know if he helped you or if you completed all of this yourself. If it is the former, you have no meaning to the federal military. If it is the latter, I think the military needs a talent like you." This was a very low-level threat and enticement, but when it came from the mouth of the Federation's military god, it immediately became different. This was because only this old man had enough qualifications to say these words and make his own promise. Sulu was silent for a long time before he said with difficulty, "Uncle helped me change my identity. I don't understand how he did it." He was a sincere person and rarely lied in life. He was an orphan in Donglin. In order to survive in his childhood, he often had to lie. His twisted and seamless life, the dance of lotus flowers and mud, gave him the most sincere and amiable appearance and even temperament. However, at the core of his appearance and temperament, in his bones, he still retained the craftiness and methods of the lowest level of Federation society. In order to survive under the cover of the simple and honest sunlight, it was not difficult to tell a big lie and deceive all living things. The military god Li Pifu was not one of the living things. Unfortunately, for the past several decades, he, that madam, and the Bureau of Proclamation only knew that the traitor who wandered the Federation with a different appearance had this ability. However, they did not know the method he used to realize this ability. Thus, at this moment, it seemed that the old man believed Su Li's explanation. The interrogation room once again returned to a deathly silence. After a long time, Li Feng, who stood behind the old man, finally let out a light breath. He took off his hat and wiped the sweat from his forehead. In a few words, Sulu had already walked the line between life and death. His life had also completely entered a different path. Madman Li definitely did not care about Su Li's life or death. However, he also did not want this person, who was worthy of being his opponent, to silently die in a military prison like this. What made Li Feng even more nervous was the content of his grandfather's questions, and the shocking secrets hidden within. He only knew that he had an extremely talented granduncle, but he did not know that his granduncle was a strange person who could break the glory of the charter. So there really was such a fierce person in this universe. At this thought, Li Feng couldn't help but look at Su Lu with a strange expression. He thought to himself that this guy's luck was a bit too good. He was actually able to be accepted as a student by his granduncle. Su Li's expression was as calm as ever, even a bit naive. However, the cold sweat had already soaked the back of his prison uniform, making it sticky and somewhat uncomfortable. After asking these two questions, War God Li Pifu closed his eyes and began to rest. It was as if the spring thunder in the room earlier had not come from his mouth. His entire person once again became that ordinary thin old man from before. There was not a trace of strangeness about him. Qing Cheng's military prison delivered 3 cups of tea. After half of the tea and the cups were gone, the old man's aged voice rang out in the interrogation room that had been silent for a long time. Only when Li Feng came to find me did I know that you were his descendant. The old man put down the teacup and looked at Su Lu as he spoke slowly. Su Lu looked at Li Feng with some surprise. He did not expect that at this time, he would be the one to ask for the war god's help. However, the reason I came to see you this time is not because you are his descendant that I see you in a different light. Although I have done some things for the Federation, my respect for the Federation's charter has always been the same as the day I first stepped into the military camp. It has never weakened in the slightest. Back then, he betrayed the Federation and violated the charter. Even if he was my biological brother, I would not let him go, let alone you. Although he knew that Li Pifu would definitely continue his words, Su Lu could not help but narrow his eyes when he heard this evaluation of his uncle. He retorted, I have been in the capital ring for more than 2 years, and I have seen far too much of the darkness of politics. Uncle betrayed the country? In my opinion, this is just a joke. Sometimes jokes are not funny. As his student, of course you would stand in his position and explain the past. The old man did not start reminiscing about the past because of this rebuttal. He calmly said, he was a cold and heartless person, but you are different. If you were also a cold and heartless person, of course I would not have come to see you today. In the past 2 days I have read all the files about you, including the surveillance video. I really want to know a question. When the smoke covered the 3 eastern sectors, how did you aim? Su Lu was silent for a moment before he raised his head and replied, can I not say? Of course you can. Everyone has their own little secrets. I am the same and so is your uncle. Li Pifu looked at Su Lu with a smile and said, even if you had that little secret, when you killed your way into the foundation building, other than that excellent sniper you did not have any backup. How confident were you in killing Macklin at that time? I think, since the children of the Tai family have already come to see you, you should already know Macklin's true identity, the old man calmly added. Su Lu was silent for a moment before he said seriously, in the beginning, I had a partner on the mountaintop. At that time I was 40% confident that I could kill Macklin. Then he ran away. Although I had Mr. Sher's help, in reality, the situation was very bad. I was not even 10% confident. The old man looked at him and said slowly, if you were not even 10% confident, why didn't you leave at that time? Why did you insist on killing Macklin? What if I didn't kill him? Things had already reached that point. Su Lu lowered his head and answered honestly, things had already reached that point. Hearing this, the old man's face was no longer stern. In his slightly cloudy and peaceful eyes, there was a hint of pride and a smile. Dozens of years ago, on the territory of the Empire, the 17th Armored Division was in charge of blocking. Seeing the Empire's imperial family's elites covering the sky and covering the earth, how could he have the courage to cross thousands of mountains and rivers to kill that person under the imperial family's flag? Although Division Commander Li at that time had a terrifying hidden strength that was beyond the imagination of the world, he was taking the biggest risk of his life. How could he have any confidence? Was he willing to do it? He was just at the end of the line, and a sense of injustice and unwillingness suddenly appeared in his chest. He was forced to that point, so he threw away life and death for the sake of speed. The old man quietly looked at the young man across the table with his head slightly lowered. He thought of the surveillance video and felt that the young man in the video was not as silent as he was today. Instead, he felt that the young man in the video was somewhat similar to himself in the past. Thinking about it carefully, this young man could be considered someone from the Lees of Philadelphia. When he thought of this, the hint of admiration in his heart finally appeared on his face without hesitation. It was like a mountain looking at a blue lake in front of a cliff that seemed to have the momentum of an ocean. A sense of joy rose in his heart. The faint admiration on the old man's face did not last long. It turned into calmness. He looked at Sulu and said, "That teacher of yours once made a very dangerous mistake. Naturally, you would not believe it. But since you believe that he will not betray the Federation, then this is the only request I have for your future. Do not betray the Federation. Can you do that?" The old man quietly looked at Sulu. A star lit up in his old and turbid eyes. The divine light was condensed and dignified. After Sulu entered the interrogation room today, his mind had been somewhat perplexed because he saw this important figure. At this moment when he heard this question, he vaguely grasped something. An unexpected joy surged into his heart. He stared back at Li Pifu's old face in a daze. After a long while, he finally replied with a hoarse voice, "Of course." This answer of course was given as a matter of course. Sulu had never believed that the old man was really a traitor who colluded with the Empire. He himself had never thought of betraying the Federation. There was another of course. In his heart, the Federation and the government were two completely different things. Hearing this answer, the old man was silent for a moment. The wrinkles on his lips became deeper and deeper. He faintly said, "If something goes wrong in the future, I will kill you myself." It was a very ordinary sentence, but it carried a power and certainty that made one unable to resist. If he said he would kill, he would kill. This was the confidence and indifference that had been cultivated through countless years of blood and fire. When Sulu heard this, he only felt numb and cold under his hair. The muscles on his back completely stiffened. Who would not be frightened when the Federation's military god said so seriously that he would kill a person? After the fear came disappointment. Sulu knew that he would survive in the end. His mood suddenly relaxed and his body also relaxed a lot. Thinking of this, he could not help but look up at Madman Li, who had been silent all this time. He seriously nodded and said, "Thank you." If Li Feng had not told the details of the fight in the Linyuan to the old man, how could this important figure who had watched the mountains and the fish by the lake for many years personally come to the military prison of Qingqing to see Sulu, the terrorist? No need to thank me. Yuzi came to find me. If you want to thank someone, thank her. Besides, since you are my student, of course I will not let you die for no reason. Li Feng stood behind the old man. There was a trace of coldness in his expression that did not match his age. There was no sense of his usual craziness. There was only calmness. He said in a cold voice, "I am not doing this for Lu Hua's sake. In my opinion, it is better that he does not have a father like you. I let you live because I hope that we can meet on the battlefield in the future and return that name to you." That name was naturally referring to the bet on the battle on Mount Kaki. From that day on, the genius Lieutenant Colonel Li Feng had to call Sulu uncle whenever he saw him. This was really a great humiliation. The old man suddenly opened his mouth and called, "Li Feng, here." Madman Li, who was staring coldly at Sulu, suddenly heard his grandfather's voice. He subconsciously stood at attention and puffed out his chest. The old man looked at Sulu. Without turning his head, he said lightly, "If Sulu betrays the Federation in the future and I die of old age, you will be responsible for killing him." Li Feng's eyes flashed with coldness. He said in a low voice, "Yes, Marshal." Suli's heart skipped a beat. "But if he does not betray, remember to call Sulu uncle when you see him in the future." "Huh." Li Feng's eyes widened. He stared at the back of his grandfather's white head, not knowing what to say. The old man did not pay attention to his reaction. He slowly stood up. Without saying anything to Sulu, he put his hands behind his back and walked out of the interrogation room with his body slightly bent. Watching the old man's figure walk past him, Sulu felt as if there was a strong wind blowing past. The wind speed was extremely slow, but it contained endless power. He knew that he should stand up at this time, but the complicated feelings of shock and relief in his heart made his legs somewhat weak. He had told a big lie about the chip replacement. In the end, he was actually able to fool the Federation's war god. Su Li's face was slightly pale. He sat in the chair, feeling both fear and relief. At this time, the old man suddenly turned his head and glanced at Su Lu. His gaze was like thunder and lightning. It fell on the incomparably hard table, as if it could directly penetrate and look below. Su Li's left hand had been carefully hidden under the table. At this time he suddenly felt a burning sensation on his wrist. Although he knew that it was caused by his state of mind, he could not help but feel great fear. He had always felt that this war god already knew everything in his heart. Fortunately, the old man did not do anything else. He only smiled and said, "I was not tricking you before. If you really know how to do those things, the Federal Army really needs you. If you can change the chip, you can naturally remove the chip. If you can remove the chip, you can go to the Empire and pretend to be a member of the royal family." These words could not be said to have woken him up. Although Su Lu also hated the Empire's invaders, after all, the war had not started for 10 years. He had not even seen a living person from the Empire, nor did he think about what he could do for this magnificent war. But when he heard these words, his mind still buzzed. He saw a ray of light in the distance. Why did the Empire have the seed plan? Because under the protection of the glory of the Charter, anyone without a chip would not be able to enter the Federation. Why was the Federation never able to obtain first-hand information about the Empire? Because all Federation citizens had a chip on the back of their neck. It was planted in them when they were infants and could not be removed for life. For the Empire, this was the biggest characteristic of the Federation people. Only Uncle Feng Yu, only he, seemed to be able to freely travel between the Federation and the Empire. If he entered the Empire, wouldn't he be able to do a lot of things for the Federation? This thought flashed through Su Li's mind, and he fell into silence. The sound of footsteps faded away. Su Lu stood up with some difficulty and turned his head to send off the backs of the old man and the young man. Above the deep corridor outside the interrogation room was a transparent dome. Sunlight shone in and fell on the old man and the young man. Li Feng was 17 years old this year. His back and waist could not be described with words. His tall and sturdy body contained incomparably terrifying strength. As he walked, every muscle under his military uniform tightened and stretched rhythmically like rocks. It was as if he was a great mountain that breathed in the morning wind. The old man beside Li Feng looked like an ordinary old man. Because of his age, the torment of the countdown to his life made his body slightly weak. Compared to Li Feng, he seemed a bit short. However, it was precisely this old man who slowly walked in the quiet corridor. The light falling from the dome seemed to be only willing to shine on his body. The soldiers on both sides of the corridor saluted with their guns. Their gazes were like the light from the dome, following this old man's movements. The soldiers in the military prison probably never thought that they would actually be able to see the face of the Federation's military god with their own eyes. They were so excited that they found it difficult to control themselves. Their faces were slightly red, and the hands that saluted with their guns trembled slightly. The old man was a true mountain, a mountain that bathed under the sunlight. Su Lu stood somewhat woodenly in the interrogation room. He watched as that mountain-like figure disappeared into the distance. He felt as if he was in a dream. He had thought that he would definitely die for killing Macklin, but Macklin was a spy for the Empire. Lady Tai knew his greatest secret, and the Bureau of Proclamation would definitely not let him go. Yet, this old man had appeared to see him. Because of the old man's appearance, he knew that he would definitely survive. Moreover, he would rely on the most extraordinary and magnificent mountain in the Federation. From today onwards, it was likely that no one would be able to use private actions against him. Perhaps even Lady Tai could only forcefully suppress her enmity toward him. The situation changed too quickly. Who could understand what it felt like? From this day onwards, Su Li's life in the military prison of Qingqing became completely different from before. Although he was still imprisoned by strict security measures, the attitude of the prison soldiers toward him became more amiable. He was allowed to watch television and read newspapers. What he wanted to eat every day, there was also a special chef who would prepare it for him. Although he still had to wear the electromagnetic shackles when he moved out every day, the remote-controlled electronic bomb sealed in the firmware had already been carefully taken out. Even the warden of the prison had to go outside his cell every day to have a heartwarming conversation with him. The interrogation of the Federation Investigation Bureau came to an abrupt end. However, the military court sent over the relevant legal documents. Sulu handed over all the legal issues that needed to be dealt with to Su Songzi. He didn't care about it because he knew that it was all just a formality. The sudden change in prison life was naturally due to the 2 consecutive visits, especially that day when Li Pifu came and talked in the secret room. The military god had made his stance known. The entire Federation had to wash their ears and listen to where the wind was blowing. On a sultry day in June, Sulu lay on the bed, enjoying the cool and fresh air through the vent. He was eating a bunch of grapes with his left hand and casually flipping through a paper book with his right hand. He was thinking about how he should deal with Shi Qinghai. At this moment, he heard the warden's extremely gentle voice from the intercom. Chapter 316. This was Su Li's last night in Qingqing's military prison. He stood by the window and looked at the wild grass outside. He thought about the ups and downs of this period of time, and couldn't help but feel emotional. With a different state of mind, the scenery in his eyes would naturally be somewhat different. His biggest worry after escaping from Donglin had been resolved just like that? Was he going to regain his freedom soon? The Lees of Philadelphia was a towering mountain. Sulu knew that the reason he could stand on this mountainside and look down at the scenery peacefully was all because of that uncle whose life he didn't know if he was alive or dead. Even if he was a Real Rock after experiencing so many things, if he still couldn't make a reasonable analysis of his life as a fugitive these past few years, then it could only be said that he was a stupid rock. However, Sulu was not stupid. The identity chip behind his neck had been changed, and he was arranged to enter Yua University. The chip's authority allowed him to enter H1, and from there, he got to know the Tai family's young master. From there, the young fugitive bumped into the highest circle of the Federation. If it wasn't for Sulu always having a strong desire to kick the uneven parts of the road, if it wasn't for the dark corners of the alleyways that made him feel a little depressed and wanted to light a fire, and if it wasn't for the path that Feng Yu had planned for him, he probably would have already become one of the Federation's youngest lieutenant colonels, a first-class technical supervisor of the Nutshell Company, had a close relationship with the Tai family, and hooked up with the Lees of Philadelphia. It could really be said that his future was bright. However, how could Feng Yu not know Su Li's character? Perhaps the later developments of this story were all within his predictions. Sulu silently thought about this point and couldn't help but feel slightly perplexed. What kind of place was the Lees of Philadelphia? How could these 2 brothers who lived in the light and darkness be so powerful to such an extent? Their intelligence, their bearing, their extremely terrifying strength, where did they learn it from? Other than Madman Li and himself, he didn't seem to have found anyone else in the Federation who would shiver all over in the summer and transform into some kind of monster. His thoughts were in a mess, and he fell into a light sleep. The night ended without a word. Facing the dawn of dawn, Sulu walked out of the cell under the escort of the officers of the Qingqing military prison, and the warden himself. He walked through a long and gloomy passage. Looking at the felons eating breakfast in the cafeteria through the transparent material, Sulu habitually nodded to them. He knew that this prison only held the most heinous criminals. It was not like what was described in literature, where there was endless injustice and darkness. But after all, they had been separated by the bars for more than 20 days. Thinking of his not-so-innocent but somewhat cold experience, he wanted to say hello one last time. The heavy metal gate slowly slid past. After going through 4 strict scanning procedures, Sulu walked out of the Qingqing military prison. He raised his head, squinted his eyes, and looked at the gloomy sky. Then, he turned back to thank the warden and the others. Then, accompanied by 2 officers, he got into the military vehicle. With his hands behind his back, the warden of the military prison watched the military vehicle turn into a small black dot on the gray road. He could not help but sigh softly. As the warden, he was very clear about the traditions and stories of the Qingqing military prison. It was basically impossible for anyone who entered this prison to get out. But as long as a prisoner got out of this prison, he would definitely become a big shot in the Federation in the future. The small-eyed man who left today was probably no exception. After a 3-hour-long flight, the military plane landed at the military airport in the suburbs of the capital. After getting off the plane, Sulu got into another dark green semi-armored military vehicle. The officers in charge of escorting him along the way were not in the mood to chat. Suli's shackles had been removed, but he did not have the urge to escape. He just squinted his eyes and greedily looked at the familiar streets of the capital outside the window, as well as the row of towering buildings in the distance. The military vehicle stopped without any warning beside the flat pool of grass in front of the Parliament Hill. "Please wait a moment. Someone will come to pick you up immediately." After saying this, the soldier on the military vehicle saluted Sulu, and then drove away from the street. Sulu subconsciously returned the salute, and then found himself in the core area of the Federation's capital. On the opposite side of the wide street was the majestic Parliament building and those familiar stone steps. The June sun was shining brightly in the sky. On the dark green grass beside them, there were people sitting in groups of 2s and 3s. Everything seemed so peaceful. He was wearing a military uniform without epaulets today, and did not have any luggage. At this moment, he was suddenly all alone and standing in the middle of a crowd. He actually felt a little lost and helpless. From time to time, people would walk past him. Many people would take photos not far from him with the Parliament building as the background. No one noticed him, and no one would have thought that this young soldier who seemed to be waiting for someone was the terrorist who had caused trouble for the Federation for half a year. Half a year ago, when Sulu was determined to kill Macklin, it was still snowing in the capital. Since then he had not been free. When he was transferred from Fox Fortress to Qingqing military prison, he who had been in the dark for a long time, was once blinded by the sunlight that he had not seen for a long time. However, this was not the case today. It was just this change of time and space, this sudden arrival of freedom, that made him feel a little lost. When he left, it was snowing. When he returned, it was already late spring. It was sunny after the snow, and it was really sunny. More than 100 days had passed, but it was actually just a moment. In the blink of an eye, the sky was clear. A black official car slid in front of him, and a few special task force agents wearing black open lapels walked out of the car. One of them looked coldly at Sulu and said, "We have arranged a place for you to bathe and eat. There is not much time. Mr. President still has a schedule in the afternoon. At noon, he will be waiting for you at the official residence." Sulu nodded subconsciously. South of the capital, George Carlin Foundation Cultural and Arts Center. In the largest auditorium of the George Carlin Foundation, the Nebula award ceremony was being held. The award ceremony was supposed to be held in January, but because of the unfortunate death of the Peace Prize candidate, Senator Medellin, it had to be postponed to today. It had to be said that the demonstrations that had occupied Charter Square and the square in front of Parliament Hill for 4 months were one of the important reasons why the award ceremony had to be postponed. The Nebula Award was an official award of the Federation, and its authority and sense of honor were unquestionable. During the process of awarding the Basic Physics Award, Space Technology Award, and Biotechnology Award, the applause in the hall did not stop. All the guests who participated in the award ceremony did not hesitate to express their sincere congratulations to the scholars who won the award. When Governor Ross replaced Senator Medellin to receive the Peace Prize, the applause in the George Carlin Foundation reached its peak. Everyone collectively stood up and expressed their most sincere respect and condolences to the old man who had fought for the Federation all his life, who had bravely resisted the invasion of the Empire, who had adhered to the principle of non-violence for the rest of his life, and who had finally died at the hands of fanatical nationalistic terrorists in Green Dragon Mountain. This mood continued until the chairman of the Nebula Award Committee raised his voice and invited President Pabre to come on stage to give a speech. Then there was a slight change. The guests who had just sat down all stood up again to welcome the arrival of the President of the Federation. Over the years, in the upper class of the Federation, the guests who were qualified to appear in the George Carlin Foundation were always somewhat disdainful or indifferent to this dark-skinned politician who came from the lowest class of miners in society. However, Mr. Pabre was now the president of the Federation, so they had to cover up their feelings very well. Especially in the past 6 months, President Pabre led the government cabinet and dealt with the chaos caused by Senator Medellin's death with extreme force and means, ensuring the smooth operation of the Federation. He demonstrated his extremely powerful political wisdom and means. The people in the upper class of the Federation had begun to accept and respect this dark-skinned middle-aged man from the bottom of their hearts. The guests looked at President Pabre on the podium and couldn't help but think about the commotion caused by the Federation government in the past few months in response to Senator Medellin's death. They couldn't help but feel a chill run down their spines. The Federation government announced the results of the investigation in the shortest time possible and appeased some people. Meanwhile, President Pabre personally went to Linhai State University City to talk to the excited students. It was said that at the scene of the conversation, President Pabre's tone was calm and his attitude was firm. However, everyone knew that President Pabre had never stopped praising George Carlin. Even the award ceremony of the Nebula Award was held at the George Carlin Foundation Cultural and Arts Center under his arrangement, 2 hands at the same time, one to appease, the other to be firm. When the fanatical Senator Medellin's youth army in the Federation occupied the square and attacked the Parliament building, and when S2 entered the factory to call for a general strike, President Pabre responded in a way that no one would have thought possible. The 3 major unions, which had been silent for nearly 2 years, came forward. The members of the 3 major unions in the Federation were countless. They represented the ordinary workers and had fought for countless years against the capitalists. They cooperated with the anti-government army in Green Dragon Mountain from afar, and their influence among the lower-class people and industrial workers was extremely far-reaching. No one would have thought that the 3 major unions would unite and stand on the government's side this time. It was only now that many people realized that President Pabre was born in a family of miners. In the past few years, he had been the chief lawyer of the 3 major unions until he officially stepped into the political arena. During those years, Mr. Pabre and his subordinates, who were still lawyers, had fought countless public interest lawsuits for the 3 major unions. They had fought for countless benefits for the lower-class people who had been harmed and insulted. Now, the 3 major unions had begun to help Mr. Pabre. With the support of the 3 major unions and the support of the families led by Lady Tai, S2 did not have a general strike like last year. The situation in S1 also quickly calmed down. There were some very subtle changes in the people's inclination. Today, although there were still many people in the Charter Square who were protesting, they could no longer affect the foundation of the Federation. Chapter 317. President Pabre was very different from his predecessors. For this politician who was born at the bottom, the inherent traditions of the Federation were definitely not an untouchable iron curtain. Of course, as the current leader of the Federation, he was not so stupid as to completely ignore compromise and balance and want to blow a strong wind in the universe. The changes he made were slow and careful. For example, the routine ball at the president's official residence for the Nebula Award winners was cancelled. Instead, the president personally attended the award ceremony and gave a passionate speech. Reverence was because of the power and authority that the president represented. Reverence was because of the Federation's political traditions and the embodiment of the Federation's will. The guests looked at President Pabre on the stage, but it did not stop them from becoming more and more confused. Why did the president make such a sudden and temporary change to the Nebula Award ceremony? The content of President Pabre's speech showed the real reason. The first half of the speech was like a very common speech, praising the scientists and artists who had made outstanding contributions to the progress of the Federation. However, the second half of the speech began to become more serious. The guests listened to the speech in disbelief. They could understand the president's criticism of the empire and his concern for the situation in the West Woods, but they could not understand why the president chose today to attack the dead and well-respected Senator Macklin. Even if they were election opponents, even if they had different political views, Senator Macklin was dead, and he was remembered and respected by many people of the Federation. Why did President Pabre do this? Where did his most basic political IQ go? The second half of the speech did not mention Macklin's name, but everyone could understand who the president was targeting. Below the stage, the governor of Jingzhou, Mr. Ross, who was holding the Peace Prize, had an extremely heavy and angry expression on his face. However, President Pabre did not stop talking. He directly pointed out the investigation done by the Capital Daily last year. The dead were gone. Did President Pabre not know that this was a big taboo? The death of a person is not as good as the extinguishing of a lamp. The lamp has light, but the place it cannot illuminate is darkness. If you do something wrong, you have to pay the price. President Pabre looked at the guests who were looking at each other in bewilderment and said coldly, "Perhaps I am not a mature politician, but I am a devoted follower of the Federation's laws. If I die, you can dig up my grave and see what color it is inside. I have the same attitude towards certain dead people." The Nebula Award ceremony ended in this strange atmosphere. President Pable's speech wouldn't be published in the newspapers, but it would definitely be circulated. As for whether it would cause another upheaval in the Federation, which had just been quiet, this was something that no one could predict. When the guests walked out of the George Carlin Center, the first thing they did was to collect the daily newspapers of the Capital Special District for the past week. The Federation seemed to want to do something about the dead Medellin. President Pabre mentioned the investigation of the Capital Special District daily. Only then did people remember that President Bob and reporter Wood, who had just been discharged from the hospital, seemed to have returned to the newspaper that was famous for exposing the truth. The police car cleared the road, and the black presidential motorcade slowly drove into the official residence. As soon as President Pabre got out of the car, he began to talk to the secretaries beside him. His voice was low, but it was exceptionally clear and powerful. Just like him, it was filled with a steady vitality and trustworthy charm. After taking office for half a year, the change of personnel in the official residence was basically over. Now, the staff and officials closest to the president were some of Mr. Pabre's partners and subordinates when he was a lawyer. The burning dream of the past had become a reality today, and these people were his most loyal subordinates. There were also some officials recommended by various parties, especially those recommended by the Madam. However, the officials recommended by the Madam were mainly in the various departments and committees, and only one was left in the official residence. The office manager of the official residence, Bryn, came up to the president and whispered a few words in his ear. President Pabre's slightly thick lips curled up in a somewhat honest smile, making no effort to hide the joy in his heart. President Pabre walked into the oval-shaped office on the west side of the official residence, sat down on a chair, and carefully reviewed the prepared documents on the table. He signed his name, made a data save and authorization confirmation, and only then did he raise his head to look at the young man standing in front of the table. With a slight smile he said, "It's a pleasure to meet you, Su Lu." "It's my honor." Su Li's throat was a little dry as he stood ramrod straight. Looking at the president of the Federation in front of him, he replied, "It's my honor." For the matter of the new standards for the MX Mecca, he had once come to the president's official residence, but at that time, he had only waited in the lounge for a night. Now he was actually standing in the legendary oval-shaped office, facing the most powerful man in the Federation. Fugitive criminal, then meeting the president of the Federation face to face. Even with Su Li's steady and resolute nature, he could not help but feel a sense of epiphany. He looked at the dark-faced President Pabre and knew that it was this president who had insisted on pardoning him. Thinking back to the many subtle connections he had with the presidential election in the past 2 years, he could not help but develop an extremely sincere and good impression of this middle-aged man. President Pabre leaned back in his chair and looked at the young man before him with great interest, his thick palms pressed together. He had already read too much of Su Li's files. On one hand, he was shocked by the deeds this young man had done, but on the other hand, he could not help but be a little puzzled. He clearly had a bright future ahead of him. Why would this person be willing to violate the laws of the Federation and kill Macklin? But when he saw Su Lu, he knew that he did not need to ask this question. This was because this young man's eyes were calm and honest, and his normal face naturally showed a look of determination and sincerity. He looked just like himself from many years ago. How many important figures of the Federation would think of their own past when they saw Su Lu? Would they think of their own clean and untainted past? The door of the office was pushed open, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Miles, walked in under the guidance of Director Breen. In his hand was a small box wrapped in a sky-blue flannel cloth. General Miles looked at Sulu and smiled, then walked to President Pabre's side and handed the box over. President Pabre stood up, opened the box and took out a medal inside. He walked to Sulu and put it on his left chest. He then patted his shoulder and said lightly, "Before you go out, remember to hide the medal. A hero like you probably won't be able to see the light of day for many years." Seeing the president himself, Sulu self-deprecatingly realized that he was still nervous. At this moment, when he discovered that he had been awarded the Purple Star Medal, his pupils couldn't help but shrink, and the hands hanging outside his sleeves subconsciously clenched tightly. Killing Macklin, the Empire's most well-hidden spy, was naturally a great service to the Federation. However, he had never expected that, other than pardoning him, the military would also award him with an incredibly valuable medal. The MX Mecha was a success. I remember that you also have a medal. You can wear that one. President Pabre noticed Suli's reaction and couldn't help but find it somewhat interesting. In a deep voice he said, "Do well in the military from now on, and resist the Empire's invaders. The Federation needs people like you." Sulu glanced at the medal on his chest out of the corner of his eye. Thinking back to his conversation with Li Pifu in the prison that day, he vaguely understood the meaning of this medal. However, looking at the situation, even the president in front of him didn't know about the complicated relationship between himself and the Lees of Philadelphia. He stood at attention and saluted the president. President Pabre was the first president to come from Donglin. He didn't know that the young man in front of him was a fellow countryman, only thinking that Sulu had once been a mine maintenance soldier in Donglin. Naturally, he couldn't help but feel a sense of closeness. Smiling, he asked, "The military court sentenced you to 732 years in prison, but I never thought that what you did was wrong. The Federation can't give you glory under the sun, and I don't think you'll ask the Federation to compensate you for the 100 days you spent in prison. If you have any thoughts, you can say them now." General Miles stood to the side and smiled at Sulu. He didn't know what kind of request this young man would make to the president. "The assassination of Macklin wasn't done by me alone." Sulu didn't hesitate and blurted out, "I also have a partner. His name is Shi Qinghai. He played a very important role in killing Macklin. He should still be imprisoned in Fox Fortress right now. I sincerely ask that Mr. President grant him special amnesty." As soon as these words were said, the originally relaxed atmosphere in the Oval Office suddenly changed. General Miles frowned and glanced at Sulu. President Pabre walked back to his desk. After a moment of silence he said, "If I remember correctly, this person called Shi Qinghai is an intelligence agent for the anti-government forces of Green Dragon Mountain." "I know, but I saw the news yesterday. I heard that Mr. President is preparing to restart negotiations with Green Dragon Mountain," Sulu replied with his head lowered. "The invasion of the Empire is imminent. The Federation needs to be united internally. I do intend to invite the leader of Nanshui to the capital for negotiations." 2 years ago, Mr. Pabre, who was still a member of Parliament, had reached an agreement with the anti-government forces of Green Dragon Mountain. Now that he was the president of the Federation, he naturally had to carry out this agreement. Although the government attributed Macklin's death to the fanatical terrorists of Green Dragon Mountain, it didn't affect the overall situation at all. President Pabre didn't need to explain anything to Sulu, but for some reason, looking at his resolute eyes, he admitted to this point. "The winter before last, when you went to S2, as well as the information transfer and negotiations, it was all facilitated by Shi Qinghai." Sulu added another bargaining chip. "You insist?" President Pabre looked at him with a heavy expression and asked, "I insist." Sulu raised his head and answered very seriously, Chapter 318. President Pabre was very different from his predecessors. For this politician, who was born at the bottom, the inherent traditions of the Federation were definitely not an untouchable iron curtain. Of course, as the current leader of the Federation, he was not so stupid as to completely ignore compromise and balance and want to blow up a strong wind in the universe. The changes he made were slow and careful. For example, The routine ball of the Nebula Award winners at the president's official residence was cancelled. Instead, the president personally attended the award ceremony and gave a passionate speech. Reverence was because of the power and authority that the president represented. Reverence was because of the political traditions of the Federation and the embodiment of the will of the Federation. The guests looked at President Pabre on the stage, but it did not prevent them from becoming more and more confused. Why did the president make such a sudden and temporary change to the Nebula Award ceremony? The content of President Pabre's speech revealed the real reason. The first half of the speech was very common. It was warm praise for the scientists and artists who had made outstanding contributions to the progress of the Federation. However, the second half of the speech began to become heavy and pointed. The guests listened to the speech in disbelief. They could understand the president's criticism of the empire, his concern for the situation in the Westwoods, and his deep hatred for terrorist activities. However, they could not understand why the president's speech was not directed at the anti-government forces in Green Dragon Mountain, but vaguely pointed at the dead senator and the special investigation that had once taken place. Even if they were election opponents, even if they had different political views, Senator Macklin was already dead. Furthermore, he was remembered and loved by many people in the Federation. Why did President Pabre do this? Where did his most basic political IQ go? After the speech, there was no mention of Macklin's name at all. However, the obscure and direct meaning could be understood by anyone. Below the stage, the governor of Jingzhou, Mr. Ross, who was holding the Peace Prize, had an extremely heavy and angry expression on his face. The dead were gone. Did President Pabre not know that this was a big taboo? The death of a person is not as good as the extinguishing of a lamp. The lamp has light, but the place it cannot illuminate is darkness. If you do something wrong, you have to pay the price. President Pabre looked at the guests who were looking at each other in bewilderment and said coldly, "Perhaps I am not a mature politician, but I am a devoted follower of the Federation's laws. If I die, you can dig up my grave and see what color it is inside. I have the same attitude towards certain dead people." The Nebula Award ceremony ended in this strange atmosphere. The staff in the office were stunned and immediately started to work to ensure that Mr. President's speech would not be published in the newspapers. However, with so many guests present, the content of the speech would definitely be leaked out. As for whether it would cause any unrest in the Federation that had just been quiet, this was something that no one could predict at the moment. The guests and officials with serious expressions walked out of the George Carlin Center. The first thing they did was to collect the Capital Special District Daily for the past week. The Federation seemed to want to do something about the dead Macklin. President Pabre mentioned the Capital Special District Daily's investigation. Only then did people remember that chief editor Bob and reporter Wood, who had just been discharged from the hospital, seemed to have returned to the newspaper that was famous for exposing the truth. The police car cleared the road, and the black presidential motorcade slowly drove into the official residence. As soon as President Pabre got out of the car, he began to give verbal instructions to the secretaries beside him. His voice was low, but it was exceptionally clear and powerful. Just like him, it was full of a steady vitality and trustworthy charm. After taking office for half a year, the change of personnel in the official residence was basically over. Today, some of the staff in the official residence were Mr. Pabre's partners and subordinates when he was a lawyer. The burning ideals of the past had become a reality today, and their loyalty and execution were unquestionable. There were also some officials recommended by various parties, especially the officials recommended by Lady Tai. These officials had been doing official work for many years, and their abilities were outstanding. They were also very experienced in dealing with the Senate, the media, and various organizations. However, the officials recommended by Lady Tai were basically arranged in important departments in several major committees. There was only one person left in the official residence. The office director of the official residence, Bryn, came up to Mr. President and whispered a few words in his ear. President Pabre's slightly thick lips slightly opened, and he smiled. He quickly walked into the oval-shaped office on the west side of the official residence, sat down on the chair, and carefully reviewed the prepared documents on the table. He signed his name, did the data storage, and confirmed the permissions. Then, he looked up and smiled at the young man standing in front of the table. He said, "Nice to meet you, Sulo. It's my honor." Su Li's throat was a little dry as he stood straight and looked at the president of the Federation in front of him. He had come to the official residence for the matter of the MX Mecha's new standards, but at that time, he had only waited for a night in the lounge. At this moment he was standing in front of the most powerful man in the Federation, and was only 3 steps away. The previous strict inspection and the cold gaze of the only person who knew the inside story, the director of the Special Task Force, made Sulu understand more deeply what it meant to meet Mr. President. A fugitive, a criminal, and then a personal meeting with the president. Even if he had a calm and determined temperament, he couldn't help but feel anxious. He looked at the tanned President Pabre and thought of Mr. President's respectable past. He then thought of the many subtle relationships he had with the presidential election in the past 2 years, and how it was this president who insisted on pardoning him. He couldn't help but feel very sincere affection and respect for him. President Pabre leaned against the back of his chair, and looked at the young man in front of him with great interest. He put his thick palms together. He had read too much about Su Li's files. On the one hand, he was shocked by the young man's abilities and achievements. On the other hand, he couldn't help but feel a little puzzled. He clearly had a bright future ahead of him, so why was this person willing to violate the laws of the Federation and kill Macklin? But when he saw Sulu, he knew that he didn't need to ask this question. This was because this young man's eyes were calm and honest, and his normal face naturally showed a look of determination and sincerity. He looked just like himself many years ago. How many big shots in the Federation would think of their own past when they saw Sulu? Would they think of their own clean and untainted past? The door of the office was pushed open, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Miles, walked in under the guidance of Director Breen. He was holding a small box wrapped in a sky-blue velvet cloth. General Miles didn't look at Sulu. He walked straight to President Pabre's side and handed the box over. President Pabre stood up and opened the box. He took out a medal from inside and walked over to Sulu, placing it on his left chest. He then patted Su Li's shoulder and said casually, "Before you go out, remember to hide the medal. A hero like you probably won't be able to see the light of day for many years." Seeing the president himself, Sulu found self-deprecatingly that he was still nervous. Now that he found that he had been awarded the Purple Star Medal, his eyes narrowed involuntarily, and the hands hanging outside his sleeves subconsciously clenched into tight fists. Killing Macklin, the Empire's most well-hidden spy, was naturally a great service to the Federation. However, he felt that he had only done it by accident. He would never have thought that, other than being pardoned, the Federation would also award him with an incomparably valuable medal. "You've done a great service to the Federation in developing the MX Mecha. I remember that you also have a medal. You can wear that one." President Pabre noticed Su Li's reaction and couldn't help but find it interesting. In a deep voice he said, "Do well in the army from now on. Resist the Empire's invasion. The Federation needs people like you." Sulu glanced at the medal on his chest from the corner of his eye. Thinking back to his conversation with Lipifu in prison that day, he vaguely understood the meaning of this medal. However, it seemed that the president in front of him didn't understand the complicated relationship between himself and the Lees of Philadelphia. He stood at attention and saluted the president. President Pabre was the first president to come from Donglin. He didn't know that the young man in front of him was from his hometown. He only knew that Sulu had once been a mine maintenance soldier in Donglin, so he naturally felt a sense of closeness. He smiled and asked, "The military court sentenced you to 713 years in prison, but I've never thought that what you did was wrong. The Federation is unable to honor you under the sun, and I don't think you'll ask the Federation to compensate you for the 100 days you spent in prison. If you have any thoughts, you can say them now." General Meyer stood to the side and looked at Sulu. He didn't know what kind of request this young man would make to the president. "The assassination of Macklin wasn't done by me alone." Sulu did not hesitate and blurted out, "I still have a partner, his name is Shi Qinghai. He was able to kill Macklin. He played a very important role in the middle. He should still be imprisoned in Foxfort. I plead for Mr. President to pardon him." As soon as these words were said, the originally relaxed atmosphere in the Oval Office suddenly changed. General Myers frowned and glanced at Sulu. President Pabre walked back to his desk. After a moment of silence he said, "If I remember correctly, this person called Shi Qinghai is an intelligence agent for the anti-government forces in Green Dragon Mountain." "I know, but I saw the news yesterday. I heard that you're preparing to restart negotiations with Green Dragon Mountain," Sulu replied with his head lowered. "The invasion of the empire is imminent. The Federation needs to be united internally. I do intend to invite the leader of Nanshui to the capital for negotiations." 2 years ago, Mr. Pabre, who was still a member of parliament, had reached an agreement with the anti-government forces in Green Dragon Mountain. Now that he had become the president of the Federation, he naturally had to carry out this agreement. Although the Federation attributed Macklin's death to the fanatical terrorists in Green Dragon Mountain, it didn't affect the overall situation at all. President Pabre didn't need to explain anything to Sulu, but for some reason, when he looked at Suli's determined eyes, he admitted to this point. 2 years ago, when you went to S2 as well as the information transfer and negotiations, it was all facilitated by Shi Qinghai. In order to save Shi Qinghai, Sulu had no choice but to reveal this little secret. Although Mr. Shi had once shouted that this was their president, as the president of the Federation, who would really care about these small details of the past? "You insist?" President Pabre looked at him with a heavy expression and asked. "I insist." Sulu raised his head and answered very seriously. He had come to the capital special district from the 1st military region just for Suli's matter. Sulu stood alone by the grass at the entrance of the president's official residence. He looked up at the sun in the sky and smelled the faint green fragrance of freshly cut grass. He was a little confused. After a while, he took off the medal on his chest and put it in his pocket, then walked out of the official residence. The Special Task Force agents in black formal suits around him did not know that this young soldier was the terrorist who hurt many colleagues at the S2 Foundation building half a year ago. After looking at him vigilantly, they watched him leave. Oh, he had no luggage on his back. He had no keys, no wallet, no bank card. He had nothing but a medal. He stood at the entrance of the president's official residence. The people coming and going did not recognize him. He did not know where he was going, because he did not even have the money to take the subway. Sulu looked up at the sky and thought for a while with narrowed eyes. Should he first contact Taizuan or Zhouyu? The problem was, did he have to go into the official residence and borrow a phone from the president? At this time, a black car without a logo slowly drove over. The pass on the window made the security personnel around the official residence not have any emotional reaction. The window slowly rolled down, revealing Taizuan's pale and thin face. He smiled and said, "Lost?" "Well, a little." Sulu smiled happily and opened the door. Taizuan waved his hand and said, "You drive." Sulu was slightly stunned. He got into the familiar driver's seat and gently stroked the perfect steering wheel. He looked at the mini radar display window on the car computer and realized that it was his car. "Where are you going?" Taizuan was wearing a military uniform today. He leaned against the window and asked, "I want to go home and have a look." Sulu started the car and at the same time reached out his hand. "But I want to make a call first." Taizuan handed over the phone. Sulu dialed a familiar number. After pausing for a moment, he said into the phone, "Yuzi, I'm out." Taizuan, who was looking out the window, narrowed his eyes slightly, as if he was blinded by the blazing sun above the capital. Sulu did not care about his reaction. He said softly to Zhouyu on the other side of the phone, "I'm sorry, that hooligan is still locked up. But they promised to do their best. Maybe he will be released soon." In the end, he said very seriously, "Thank you." The black car passed through the number 2 highway. Accompanied by the slight hum of the engine, the sunroof opened. The sun and the warm wind of late spring came in and sprinkled on Sulu and Taijuan's upper bodies. The wind blew their hair. "It's easy to get sick when you're exposed to too much wind," Taijuan said. "You've been in the army for so long. Isn't your body stronger than before?" From Taijuan's military uniform and slightly changed temperament and facial color, Sulu had long guessed where this guy had been hiding for more than a year. Sulu had never cared about Taijuan's identity. He was the crown prince who was worshipped by most people in the Federation. He was only his friend, and the weaker one among his friends. This was because the crown prince's body was not very good. He had fainted in his arms before. I can't believe you were promoted to a major so quickly. I've done so many things, but I'm still just a captain. I was trained in the military. In the Lufeng Slope Club, the lieutenant colonel epaulets were already prepared for you. But in the end you ran to S2 to play the role of a lone hero. A faint mockery seeped out from Taizion's hairy upper lip. He was younger than Sulu, but that weak and inexperienced feeling had long been blown away by the wind and smoke of Green Dragon Mountain. All that was left was calmness and confidence. Sulu raised his eyebrows and said, I never wanted to play the role of a hero. Who knew that Macklin was actually a spy for the Empire? I admit, I'm just a guy with too much luck. He took out the medal from his jacket pocket and threw it over. Taizion looked at the shining purple star medal in his hand and said with a sigh, when Li Pifu was your age, he only had 2 purple stars on his chest. Sulu smiled and didn't continue to discuss his own matters. He began to ask Taizion about his life in the military for more than a year. He hadn't seen blood. Had he ever fired a gun? How did he get first place in the anti-terrorism exercise? And if there were any other girls besides Bai Qi? In the black car, cheerful laughter gradually sounded. Traveling in the free wind and sunshine, a young man had forgotten the darkness of blood and fire, and a young man had forgotten his identity and status. Just like in H1 a long time ago, through the intercom they were talking about very interesting things. At the corner of the corridor, Sulu took out a key and opened the door of Wangdu apartment. This was the first time Taizion had come to this apartment. Like the owner of the place, he walked straight to the sofa and sat down. He seriously looked at the size and layout of the room. The air circulation system of the apartment had always been working well. Although no one had lived here for more than half a year, there was still no dust or dirt. Sulu poured a cup of tea for Taizion and then walked to the balcony. He looked at the green vines and leaves that had regrown and smiled slightly. Yuzi lived here after she got pregnant? Taizion put down the teacup and suddenly asked. Yes, in June the Zhou family took her back. Sulu didn't turn around and said, the key I took just now was prepared for her. She always likes to forget to bring her key when she goes out. Zoliuhua. I went to take a look. Chapter 320. Taizion walked to the door and saw Sulu sharpening the knife by the sink. He frowned and said coldly, You're going to make dinner for me personally? Should I feel honored? He knew what Sulu wanted to do, so he deliberately said this to dispel his thoughts. Sulu also knew what he meant, so he didn't stop his hands. He lowered his head and let the thin water flow on the tip of the knife. He said softly, I have something to do tonight, so I won't accompany you for dinner. Don't be so naive. You should think about why President Li Pifu Pabre is willing to stand up for you, instead of making a scene at the wedding to avenge yourself and Shi Qinghai. Taizion frowned and said disapprovingly, I don't want to make a scene, I just want to ask him face to face, and then, he has to give me back what he should give me back. Sulu paused for a moment and said seriously. Taizion looked at the firm lines on his side face and sighed softly. He thought that this guy's character hadn't changed at all. Even after experiencing so many major events and being locked in a dark prison for so long, he still didn't change at all. Once he set his mind on something, he would do it. He didn't look like a person who had just gotten freedom, who should be happy but still be afraid of self-controlled. In the evening, the capital special district was bathed in the western sunset glow. The gentle spring breeze and blooming flowers and trees were showing off on both sides of the street. At the end of Lixing Avenue, one could faintly see the high-rise buildings in the city center in the distance and the aircraft gliding by from time to time. All kinds of cars were parked outside a seemingly inconspicuous hotel, and the three-dimensional ray color map at the entrance was constantly changing words and graphics. A black car was parked on the opposite side of Lixing Avenue. The window was rolled down, and one could faintly hear the wedding MC's voice and soft music. Sulu squinted his eyes and looked over there. He noticed that most of the cars outside the hotel were military vehicles with special license plates of each state. The vehicles were covered with dust, so they must have just come here after a long journey. On the small light screen at the entrance of the hotel, in addition to the changing images and words, there was a row of words that had never changed. Congratulations to Mr. Ning He and Miss Bao Xiaoli on their wedding, and may they grow old together. Ning He is Bai Yulan's sworn brother. They are both from the 17th Armored Division. Back then on the mining planet in Bermuda, they saved each other's lives. Therefore, when Ning He gets married, your secretary has to be present. Maybe he doesn't know that you've been released from prison. Otherwise, he wouldn't have come back so openly. Taixian put down the phone and told Sulu what he had just heard. As the crown prince of the Tai family, even though he had a huge conflict with Macho, it was very easy for him to know the files and past of most of the people in the Federation. Sworn brothers. When Sulu heard these 4 words, he thought of the train trip he and Bai Yulan took from the capital to Hong Kong every week last year. He thought of the seamless cooperation they had when they were developing the MX Mecha. He thought of the rashness at the old moon base and the silence outside the S24 States Peace Foundation building. He couldn't help but feel a little depressed. Tai Ziyuan's gaze lightly swept past the dusty license plates of the military vehicles at the entrance of the hotel. With his status, accompanying Sulu to this place was already giving him enough face. However, when he thought of Suli's personality, he couldn't help but say a few more words. Bai Yulan was expelled from the military court, so he joined Whitewater. But Ning He is different. He has always been in the military and is doing very well. Today, there should be quite a few officers from the 17th Armored Division here. These people have a good relationship with Bai Yulan. And those people from the 7th Armored Division. Bai Yulan isn't in active service, but after the incident with the 7th Armored Division, Bai Yulan took all the responsibility. The others didn't have anything to do with it. These people all follow Bai Yulan's lead, so I think they are all willing to give their lives for him. He pointed at the military vehicles and said, most of them are from the 1st Armored Division. Although they have returned to their respective units and become the trump cards of their respective units, they are still very much alive. But I think if anything happens to Bai Yulan, the speed at which they pull out their guns won't slow down at all. Sulu knew that Taixian was warning him. In the Federation society, no matter how strong one's background was, if they were to encounter a group of red-eyed active duty officers, they would only be unlucky. This was also why Zhou Yu dared to order the guards to open fire in Linhai State, while the second generation of the 7 great families were much more cautious. Since ancient times, the barrel of a gun had its own unique power and magic. I just wanted to ask him a few questions, Sulu explained again. Taixian thought to himself, then why did you sharpen your knife so hard? He said softly, the young officer is someone that many people want to win over. Bai Yulan is not an active duty soldier, but he has enough influence in this circle. Of course, this is what he deserves because he has taken the blame for many of these soldiers, taken the blame and saved their lives. I heard that Shunli sent a gift, so it seems that Bai Yulan's appearance is something that my mother has acquiesced to. I won't get involved in this matter, so be careful. Sulu nodded, opened the door and walked out. He avoided the roaring cars on Lixing Avenue, walked past the dusty military vehicles, and stopped at the side door of the hotel. He raised his head and looked at the rotating words of blessing on the 3-dimensional hologram. Through the glass, he looked at the couple on the stage who were smiling happily. His heart warmed slightly, and he decided to wait outside so as not to disturb some irrelevant people. The hotel where the ceremony was held was not very eye-catching, but the wine and food at the wedding banquet were quite good. The wild beef bought from the black market was served as complex protein meat, and the guests tasted it with satisfaction, tacitly silent. The HTD Bureau of the Federation still seemed to strictly enforce the wildlife protection law, but in fact in many occasions, especially in many occasions in the capital, this law had become a cover. Major Ning He was 31 years old this year. 2 years ago, he was transferred from the 8,384th Unit, which was the 17th Armored Division, to the office of the 1st Military Region's General Staff Officer. Now, he was already a Level 2 Combat Staff Officer. Although he was not a big shot, he had a very good future. At his wedding banquet, many important people from the military region were invited. In this kind of occasion, the HTD Bureau would not blindly carry out official business. According to the tradition of the Federation, Ning He and the bride drank wine and fed each other a piece of soft deep-sea shellfish meat, which represented their affection. The ceremony was almost done. After the chief made a speech on behalf of the staff officer's office, the guests began to eat happily, waiting for the couple to come forward and toast. After a busy day, Ning He felt a little tired, but as the groom, he couldn't let this tiredness show. He whispered something to the bride, then turned his head and saw a familiar figure in the side hall. A sincere smile appeared on his face. He and Bai Yulan had been comrades for many years. They were comrades who had squeezed into the same Mecca and trusted each other in life and death. Although the two of them had not seen each other much in the past few years, and because of the Whitewater Company case, Bai Yulan had deliberately distanced herself from them, but Ning He admitted that he still saw Bai Yulan as his most trusted partner. Today was his wedding day. If Bai Yulan was not here, it would be a regret that could not be made up for. Fortunately, he had rushed back. Ning He raised the empty glass in his hand towards the side hall and smiled. He noticed that Bai Yulan's smile was as calm as usual, but there was an unusual hint of heaviness between her brows. Ning He frowned slightly. He knew that Bai Yulan seemed to have been on some secret mission and caused some trouble. However, with his ability in the military region, he could not find any clues. The moment he turned his head, his gaze swept across the hotel's floor-to-ceiling window. He saw a person standing outside the window and couldn't help but freeze. The young man outside the hotel had an ordinary face and was dressed plainly. His slightly squinted eyes were faintly visible. He gave off an amiable feeling, like a passerby waiting for someone. But for some reason, Ning He felt that this person was very dangerous, extremely dangerous. And the person he was waiting for was definitely someone at the wedding venue. Ning He, who had survived the battle with the Empire in Bermuda, would not feel the slightest bit of fear because of the appearance of such a person. He just did not want to be disturbed at his wedding. He waved his hand and called for an officer in the side hall. He whispered a few words and the officer's eyebrows twitched slightly. There was a hint of disdain and hatred in his eyes as he nodded. Sulu did not want to disturb the most important day of a newlywed's life, so he obediently waited outside the hotel. He deliberately put some distance between himself and the entrance of the hotel. However, he did not know that his presence had already disturbed the other party. The sky gradually darkened, and the guests in the hotel had basically all left. Only a few tables of officers in the side hall, the soldiers who had gone through life and death with the groom, were still drinking. After going through all this with great difficulty, Ning He smiled bitterly and cupped his hands in farewell. Surrounded by a group of people, he walked to the main entrance of the hotel and prepared to board the limousine and leave. Ning He glanced out of the corner of his eye and saw that the eye-catching young man was still waiting in the distance. He lowered his head and said to the officer beside him, "I don't want to upset Xiaoli, so I'll go with her first. You let Xiao Bai leave through the side door." "Lao Bai drank a little too much and won't leave," the officer said disdainfully. "What are you afraid of if you go through the front door? Today is your big day. I'll kill whoever dares to cause trouble. Don't worry, I'll take care of this." Ning He smiled and said, "I'm just afraid that you'll make a big deal out of this." The officer beside him was called Xiong Lin Quan. He was the gunner of Team 7 back in the day. He had followed Bai Yulan to those remote mineral planets and killed countless pirates and Imperial Special Forces who had infiltrated. This person was fierce, and his methods of dealing with trouble were unusually direct and efficient. Ning He had absolute faith in his abilities. It was just that this was a special day, so he said a few more words. From the bottom of their hearts, these soldiers did not think that the man in the distance was any real trouble, so they were not very worried. After a few words of idle chatter, the groom got into his wedding car and left amidst the cheers and jeers of the bride's sisters. Watching the newlyweds' motorcade leave the hotel, Su Lu, who had been standing there for a long time, sighed softly. He did not feel too much regret, but he did feel a little envious. 2 years ago he had made a lot of warm life plans. He wanted to marry Zhang Xiaoming, have children, buy a house and work. Who would have thought that his life would turn into such a strange shape? He had become a stranger to that beautiful girl and he rarely thought of her recently. Earlier, too many guests had come out of the hotel, so he had retreated to the corner of the street. At this time he was about to take a few steps toward the front door when he unexpectedly saw a few officers in dark green military uniforms walking directly toward him. "What do you do?" Xiong Linquan asked with a cold face. The coldness and arrogance in his bones were obvious, and he had not trimmed them in the slightest. "I'm waiting for someone," answered Sulu. "Who are you waiting for?" Sulu said with a smile, "By Magnolia." After a moment of silence, the officers frowned at the same time. No matter how unreasonable a soldier was, it was impossible for them to directly wave their fists and hit someone on the streets of the capital, so Xiong Linquan suppressed his temper and asked a few questions. He did not expect this person to answer so simply and directly. It turned out that this guy was really here to cause trouble for Lao Bai. After confirming this, Xiong Linquan and the officers beside him did not have the slightest bit of vigilance. Instead, they felt a little happy. There were not many opportunities to solve problems for Lao Bai. If it were based on their nature, they would be willing to knock this young man to the ground, step on him a few times, spit on him, and then drag him to the hotel like a dead dog and let him lie at Lao Bai's feet. However, before Ning He left, Xiong Linquan had already told him not to do anything, so he did not do anything. He only coldly raised his chin and lightly waved the index finger of his right hand. "Today we're holding a joyous occasion here. You don't have to wait anymore. If you want to die for Lao Bai, come back another day." These soldiers could feel the danger that Su Li's calm represented, but they did not care because their lives were always accompanied by danger. Moreover, today, the 17th Armored Division and the fierce figures of the 7th Squad were gathered in the hotel. If Ning He was personally handling this matter, perhaps he would not have added those last provocative words. But Xiong Linquan was not this kind of person. Sulu did not react to these words, only smiling. As the technical director of the 7th Squad, although the 7th Squad had long been in a semi-disbanded state, and although he had not seen a single member of the squad, he had seen the files and knew the character and ability of this officer in front of him. His calmness in front of Xiong Linquan was a provocation. Xiong Linquan tilted his head and moved extremely close to him. He extended his right index finger and pointed it at the other's eyes. He said softly with a smile, "If I had a gun, I would have shot you. The problem is that I'm here to attend a wedding. According to the rules, I can't bring a gun, so I can't shoot you. If you make a move, I'll smash you into pieces. The problem is that you're definitely going to dress as a woman, and there are also Federation laws, so I can't beat you up." Xiong Linquan straightened his body, looked at Sulu with slight mockery, and said, "What happens next will definitely be a little interesting." After saying this, he tidied up his military uniform, turned around and left, not paying any more attention to Sulu. Suli's brows furrowed slightly. Looking at this person's back, a trace of alarm appeared in his heart. With a loud roar of the accelerator, a dark green military vehicle suddenly started. It vibrated and rushed directly from the road onto the sidewalk, brushing past Xiong Linquan's side and crashing towards Sulu. The military vehicle started so violently that the dust on the dark green body of the vehicle trembled. Like an arrow released from a bow, it slammed into Suli's body. In an instant, the hard lines of the vehicle were only a few meters away from Sulu. He couldn't shoot, so it was inconvenient for him to make the first move. Then, a traffic accident would happen. In this instant, Sulu understood what the other was trying to do. His pupils constricted slightly as he looked at the military vehicle coming toward him, but his feet were as steady as iron and didn't move at all. Accompanied by the smell of burning and the sharp and short sound of brakes, the dark green military vehicle came to an abrupt stop. The bottom metal plate at the front of the vehicle was less than half a meter away from Suli's knees. Sulu didn't move. It wasn't because he didn't react in time, but because there was probably no one in the Federation with a faster reaction time than him. It wasn't that he wanted to pretend to be calm and indifferent and ignore the dangerous aura of the military vehicle just now. It was because after experiencing so many major events, his state of mind was strong enough to know that the other was just trying to scare him. Most importantly, he knew his own body well. This body was becoming more and more like the number one machine that the uncle had once mentioned. Even if the military vehicle didn't stop just now, he had enough time to dodge. Or even counterattack. Xiong Linquan and the other officers turned around with disdainful smiles. They were prepared to see Sulu fall to the ground in fear, or even go limp. However, They didn't expect to see Sulu still standing in front of the military vehicle. He didn't move at all. Other than his eyes narrowing even more than before, there was no reaction at all. The expressions of Xiong Linquan and the other officers suddenly became serious. The expressions of Xiong Linquan and the other officers also became very interesting. In an instant, their faces turned white and then black as iron. They were different from Lu Jiao. They were all combat personnel. Although they were shocked by Su Li's terrifying kick, they immediately thought of preparing for battle. Who the fuck is this person? What kind of leg is this? Xiong Linquan thought in his heart. After being in the military for so many years, he had seen many powerful special forces soldiers. However, other than the few people who were rumored to be gods at the front line of the West Woods, where had he seen such a fierce person in real life? Although he was a little confused, his hands did not slow down. He had already reached for the gun at his waist. The Federal Army regulations strictly prohibited the carrying of firearms when going out in private. However, he was a gun fanatic and still carried a pistol. At this moment, he was a little doubtful that he could knock down the person in front of him with just a pistol. It seemed like he should have brought a Kian over. Seeing that the soldiers in front of him were preparing to take out their guns, Sulu narrowed his eyes. The muscles behind his calves bunched up. Just as he was about to pounce over and knock down the person, he heard a familiar voice. "Put away your gun. If you don't want to die, this is the officer." He had not heard this voice for half a year. But it was still so soft and gentle. Just like every day last year, she stayed by Su Li's side, asking him what kind of tea he wanted to drink and where to put his clothes. Chapter 321. Whether it was guilt, fear, or the desire to use the wine in his glass to commemorate Su Lu, who he thought was dead, Bai Yulan drank a lot at his brother's wedding. People who drank tended to sweat easily. His sweat dampened a few strands of black hair on his forehead, like dewdrops sliding down the willow branches and into the lake. Bai Yulan was not a dazzlingly handsome man like Shi Qinghai and young Master Li. He just blindly hit his murderous intent with gentleness. His black hair scattered in front of his smooth forehead, drawing out a few pieces of complicated and shocked expression in his eyes. After quietly leaving the mountain behind the Golden Foundation building, he thought Su Lu was dead for sure. After all, the Black Prison and Special Amnesty were classified secrets of the Federation. He was just a chess piece placed by the big shots beside Su Lu, so he didn't know what had happened. Only now, outside the hotel, seeing Su Lu slowly retract his right leg, did he know that Su Lu was still alive. This is good, Bai Yulan thought to himself. He walked past Xiong Linquan and stood in front of Su Lu. He said softly, "Hello, boss." Hearing the word boss, Su Li's lips curved into a slight smile. His gaze didn't fall on Bai Yulan's face, because he didn't know what would happen if he looked at him a few more times. He looked at the officers behind Bai Yulan, who were on high alert, and said with narrowed eyes, "Now it seems that what you said when I first entered Whitewater was not false at all. Team 7 really is yours." Bai Yulan didn't answer, only standing quietly in front of him. The officers who were preparing to draw their guns found the atmosphere to be a little strange. They didn't move for a moment, only staring warily at Su Lu. Another person that Su Lu recognized ran out of the hotel. It was Lan Xiaolong, who had once been in charge of protecting Su Lu. Lan Xiaolong was Bai Yulan's comrade in the 17th Armored Division. He had once participated in the development of the MX Mecha. Although he didn't know what had happened after that, he knew very well that the problem between Su Lu and Bai Yulan wasn't something he could interfere with. With a solemn expression, he said a few words to the officers and drove them far away. However, if blood really did appear later, these people would definitely not stand by and watch. How about we find a quiet place to talk? Bai Yulan didn't ask how Su Lu managed to get out of the military prison alive, nor did she try to escape. She just calmly asked for instructions, just like she had done many times in the past. "This place is pretty good." Su Lu lowered his gaze, looked at him and said, "I just want to ask you a few questions." "Go ahead and ask." Since it's already come to this, I'm sure you know that there's no need for me to lie to you. Bai Yulan used her fingers to gently push away the wet hair in front of her face. She put her hands into her pockets and looked up calmly. Sulu was silent for a moment, then suddenly asked, "The people lying in the hospital are your parents, right?" Bai Yulan's expression froze slightly. Then she slowly replied, "Yes." "You were really sent to the military court because of your illegal activities?" "Yes." "Do you really love money that much?" "Yes." "Did I give you 20 million? "Yes." "Are all the things you told me true?" Sulu stared into his eyes and asked. "After that, I kept asking myself, what exactly is true and what is false? Everything I told you is true, but there are some things that I didn't tell you. Including that day when we went up the mountain. When I asked you to leave for the last time, you said that you wanted to go crazy with me." Bai Yulan was silent for a long time, then said, "Yes, that's what I thought at that time." Sulu looked at him silently. He didn't ask why he left and gave his hands to death. Sulu looked at his toes and smiled uncomfortably. After being locked up in the black prison of Fox Fortress for more than 100 days, other than chatting with that old thing, he spent most of his free time reminiscing about the details of this operation and the more distant days. Bai Yulan's departure was a devastating blow to the plan to assassinate Macklin. If it wasn't for the Federation's the glory of the Charter shining into Su Li's black eyes at the most desperate moment, he and Shi Qinghai would probably have died a long time ago. After thinking about it carefully, Sulu couldn't find a reason why Bai Yulan would betray him. After being together for such a long time, he thought that he understood this delicate man very well. It wasn't until he looked forward for a long time that he finally understood the reason behind it. Being able to get to know Bai Yulan and take in this fierce and delicate man who was good at assassinating security guards, as his assistant had happened after Sulu entered the 7th Combat Team of Whitewater Company. And when he entered Whitewater Company, it was after the data dispute in the laboratory that the Tai family had moved him away from the center of the storm. In other words, his meeting with Bai Yulan had been arranged by Big Secretary Shen. Looking at the source, all his questions were answered. Bai Yulan was, and had always been, a spy planted by the Tai family by his side. At the back of Macho's mountain, Sulu had said that he would work with the Tai family. How could the Qianshi Tai family be at ease with working with him? From that moment on, Sulu had been developing the MX Mecha and going to the old moon base for more than half a year. His whereabouts and details were all under Lady Tai's watch. But at that time both sides had the same interests, so this cooperation didn't cause any problems. Until the Flowing Wind Slope Club, when Sulu was determined to kill Macklin, Bai Yulan didn't know why, but she didn't send this vague judgment back to Macho's mountain. Until the last moment, when Lady Tai laid down this foreshadowing, Bai Yulan floated away, and Sulu fell into a dead end. The front cover of the dark green military vehicle was tilted up, and the sound of the siren covered the conversation between the two people. The officers who were attending the wedding were vigilantly surrounding the periphery, looking at Bai Yulan and Su Li's figures with suspicion and nervousness. But at this time the white smoke billowed, and the two figures were somewhat blurry. Everyone has their own principles. I accept this. Sulu raised his head and said in a low voice, "You took Lady Tai's money first, and you follow the principle of first come, first served. I accept that. Even if you took the money and didn't work with your life, I also accept that. But you joined in and sold me out. This, I can't accept." Hearing these words, Bai Yulan just kept silent. Her slightly wet black hair swayed in front of his eyes like a good hypnotist, making him fall into a strange state of mind. "In the building I was shot 14 times. The hard ceramic bulletproof vest you found for me was very good. There were 4 holes, but there were no major problems." Sulu stared at her eyes under the black hair, and his voice was very faint and distant, "But that was 14 times. I lost a lot of blood and a lot of bones were broken. I almost died. In fact, I thought I was going to die that time." Sulu was severely injured in the Golden Foundation building. If he didn't have the vitality of a crustacean, even if the medical soldiers of the 2nd Military Region saved him in time, he probably would have died. Even if he was still alive, he should be lying on a white hospital bed right now. He wouldn't be able to stand in front of Magnolia Orchid like he was right now. He wouldn't be able to talk about what happened to him with a lonely voice. "I still have a brother who is now being detained by the Federation government. I don't know how long he can last. Sulu said very seriously. We didn't die. Logically speaking, I should feel lucky and then forget everything about you. After all, we didn't die. If he died, I would definitely kill you. If I died, he would probably kill you too. But you stabbed me. Sulu narrowed his eyes and said, You stabbed me hard in the back. It hurts, so I'm not in a good mood. That's why I came to find you today. Was this pain a physical pain, or was it the pain of betrayal? Sulu didn't say anything. His narrowed eyes were full of seriousness, but Bai Yulan heard it clearly. She sighed softly in her heart. Just like what she said to Sulu in the past, the life experience since childhood and the cruel life after joining the army made her not have many warm feelings for the world, except for the comrades who went through life and death with him and the silent but very amiable Money. However, following Secretary Shun's instructions and following Su Li's side for so long, Bai Yulan's reserved ideals were also imperceptibly changing. She had never met a person as simple, direct, and pure as Su Lu. She originally thought that by following Su Lu, she would also be a little more simple, direct, and pure. In the end, she didn't expect that things wouldn't go as she wished. In the end, she was still a monitor, a sharp chess piece. Bai Yulan was silent for a moment. Then she took her right hand out of her trouser pocket. Holding a delicate knife between 3 fingers, she used the sharp edge of the knife to gently push away the wet black hair above her eyes. Looking at Su Lu, she said very seriously, Stab me back. Within the circles of the 17th Armored Division and Whitewater 7th Combat Team, Bai Yulan, who had once served as the captain of the Special Knife Team, was, without a doubt, an extremely powerful figure. Officers who were older than her called him Little White.